worst set of behaviour.
He Māori aho.
Your single source of truth.
The words don't pull it for me.
My husband is Samoan, so talofa. Ngā tikanga reo, tika tahi.
Che Guevara of New Zealand's Parliament, Chloe Slaughter.
Greenhouses.
And it's communist.
He whakatū future.
They've got mata, running holidays.
Kia ora tātou, no mai, hara mai. Welcome to the All Report episode 3. My name is Pere Huriwai-seger and I'm joined by my beautiful wife and co-host, Samah.
Kia ora everyone.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We've got an awesome episode for you today. We've packed in a lot of stuff, probably too much stuff. In the last episode, we were saying we're going to try and make this like a 1 hour length stream, but every time we put things together, we just go on crazy tangents and there's so much stuff to talk about.
Everything's connected.
It's all relevant, but we are really struggling to condense these things. So, aroha mai, it might be another long night, but it's good stuff. So, thanks for being here. Make sure if you're going to leave any comments, keep it respectful, okay? Keep it respectful. We want this space to be, the kind of space where our people can come and just chat and hang out and have fun. And so, just keep it friendly, everyone. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about a lot about the environment, the polls that have been coming out, a bit about Palestine, privatization, all of that stuff. And again, I just have to say, welcome back, everybody, to this sweaty, incredibly hot cabin that we have here for the stream. But tonight's going to be good. Tonight's going to be good. So again, welcome, everybody. Welcome. Samah, you want to take our first segment? Are you ready?
Yeah, bring it on.
Ka pai. All right, let's do this.
So, I watched Parliament TV this week, and I have decided to include a bit of a Parliament unpack, and maybe this will be a regular or semi-regular segment on our show, Parliament Unpack, and it's Samah telling you all the things that I think are the most important things that happened in Parliament this week, because it's extremely boring. Most of us don't watch it, and that's where all the business happens. A lot of theatre as well, don't get me wrong, but for sure a lot of interesting stuff. So let's get into our new segment, Parliament Unpacked. So to summarise, basically, the overarching summary that I have of this week in Parliament was a lot of people from the opposition, Labour, Greens and Te Pāti Māori, trying their best to challenge the government. And every single time, without exception, National responded by blaming Labour. So everything is Labour's fault for being in government previously.
Of course.
And a lot of stuff is, but the way that they just deflect every single answer by blaming Labour.
Lazy.
Or the second way that they like to deflect is by just telling people they don't understand economics and just by being patronising. So basically, we'll never get any proper answers to question time because apparently there's no rule that says you have to answer a question and you can just say Labour did it and that counts as an answer. So so that's basically how Parliament works.
Good summary.
I have like 2 Parliament losers of the week.
Okay.
I need to dub them with a name as well. So give us your ideas, folks. Maybe our unparliamentarian politician of the week.
Okay, yeah.
And I have 2 that I've tied for this week. And they are probably going to be recurring characters. The first one is Chris Bishop. And he said this absolutely outrageous thing, which I think really speaks to the mentality of this government. It's a classic white supremacist ideology. And honestly, it's shameful. And I think the whole world should see it and see what the New Zealand government really thinks of everyone else. Let's have a look.
But I tell you, here's the rub. How do you have a better public health system? Growth. How do you have a better standard of living? Growth. How do you have a better education system? Growth. In fact, here's the truth. What are the countries that look after the environment best? Wealthy countries that grow. The poorest economies in the world desecrate the environment. They ravage the environment. I invite the member to travel through the developing world. He will...
Bishop.
So there you go, folks. Chris Bishop thinks that the poorer countries are the ones that desecrate the environment. Now, of course, this goes against all available evidence. Let's just get straight through the evidence. Let's not bother arguing with Chris Bishop and his made-up fantasies. Fossil fuel consumption per capita. Let's have a look at that one. You can see there, high-income countries at the top with 43,000 kilowatts. This is per capita, by the way, so it's not total per country, but per capita. And then look at the bottom there, low, middle-income countries, 5,000. So almost 10 times more than lower middle-income countries. And that's just fossil fuel consumption. And of course, New Zealand themselves, look at that, almost 10 times as much as the average in Africa. So in terms of fossil fuel consumption alone, New Zealand and rich countries desecrate their environment more than poor countries. Next, because they might not include fertilizer use in that, by the way, which is also made from fossil fuels. Take a look at that. New Zealand, top fertilizer user per capita. And fertilizer use causes havoc on the environment. It desecrates the environment. It ruins our waterways, and it damages our ability to grow food in the future. Next, this page is just an overall summary of why that's a myth about New Zealand being really pure. They talk about the fact that we are number one in the world to have the highest proportion of endangered native species. So that's another number one for us, along with the fertilizer use one. And then, of course, they talk about how terrible our rivers are doing. The lowland rivers in particular were among the worst in the world. We've lost over 90% of wetlands. I think we have more native fish that are endangered than any other country. So they list all of our shameful qualities, and it's very clear that New Zealand is not clean and green as Bishop and this government like to make out. But yeah, all of this just to say, obviously, that Chris Bishop's idea about who desecrates the world more is informed nothing else other than by white supremacy, because all the facts point to the idea that it is actually the wealthy countries that destroy their own environments as well as other environments. Because what we do, like for example, when we import things to feed our cows, like feed, that's, for example, palm kernel expeller, that's actually done at the expense of other countries whose environments we're destroying to get those. So not only are we desecrating our own environment, we're desecrating other environments as well.
Killed it, yep.
And just one last point on that. The reason Chris Bishop thinks that wealthy countries look after their environments more than poor countries, even though obviously the evidence says otherwise, is because rich countries are better at hiding it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's all it is. You can see that developing countries simply do not use as many resources as us, but they're not as good at building massive prisons around where they destroy the environment to hide it from the world. Things like that. And of course, on top of that, these countries are being destroyed by the wealthy countries. So just to add insult to injury. So that's our unparliamentarian politician number one of the week.
Bish Flap.
Bish Flap, yeah. And our number two is also going to likely be a regular. It's Shane Jones. And he just loves bullying people. That's his whole shtick. He spent the entire week just barking, to use Shane Jones' own words, while others were trying to speak. And one of his favorite things that he gets a kick out of is basically making fun of Māori and Māori culture to please the whites and the racists in his coalition. And
their voters.
And their voters. And I just find that especially disgusting. Like, he can't see or he doesn't care that he's being used to push these anti-Māori narratives. And just to give you an example of the kind of thing he does, take a look at Marama Davidson asking Luxon if he still thinks that Māori ceded sovereignty.
Does he still stand by his statement, quote, Māori ceded sovereignty to the Crown?
Yes.
See how he said, he's jumping in to validate the Prime Minister's extremely racist and extremely harmful assertion that Māori ceded their sovereignty. And he's being like, oh, I'm the Māori guy on this side who agrees that Māori ceded their sovereignty. I just think it's
Shameful.
I think it's shameful. And here's more example of Shane Jones' shamefulness. And it comes during their discussion about Tākuta Whereas and the decision of the Privileges Committee. So they upheld the complaint. They said that Tākuta Whereas misled Parliament, because basically what happens is he said that politicians are masters of obfuscation. It turns out, and it's a basic fact. It turns out you're not actually allowed to call other politicians liars. And so someone stood up and said, you need to withdraw and apologize for calling us liars. And Tākuta Whereas said, I didn't call you liars. So they sent him to the Privileges Committee, who decided, actually, you did in fact call us liars by saying we're masters of obfuscation, and you misled the House when you said you didn't. And they upheld this ridiculous complaint. It's not the first time they've upheld complaints against Te Pāti Māori members. They did this with the haka.
Oh, wait up. But also just look at how they've framed the headline, right? It doesn't give much information. If you're just scrolling past headlines, you're just going to see it saying, you know, that Te Pāti Māori has been dishonest or is deliberately misleading. But it's, you know, it's such a small, the tiniest offence. But like someone just reading the headlines is just going to be, oh, typical Pāti Māori.
It reminds me of News Talk ZP. They put out a headline as well, and they said, Māori Party is under police investigation, and all these angry comments. But then you click the article and it says, Māori Party asked for a police investigation because they want to clear their name.
Right.
But yeah, they're always farming anti-Māori outrage with their titles.
Truth.
Kapai, so I was just going to quickly say that they've already referred other Māori Party MPs to the Parliament Privileges Committee, and Penny Henare in this case. And actually credit to Chris Hipkins, he pointed out the fact that they only sent the Māori MPs doing the haka to the Privileges Committee, even though there were non-Māori also doing the haka. But anyway, so they're talking, so this is the day of Tākuta Whereas's debate about the outcome of the Privileges Committee, right? And Shane Jones starts the day by saying to Tākuta Whereas, tell the truth. So Tākuta just stood up to speak his normal speaking time, and Shane Jones, as he does, he interrupts, and the first thing he says is, tell the truth. Now, Karen McAnulty rightly points out that is basically calling people liars.
Totally.
He says it's calling people untruthful.
Totally.
And says, isn't that unparliamentary? And the speakers are, oh, I didn't hear it, blah, 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 and they do nothing about it. So just log that Shane Jones starts the day by effectively doing the same thing that Tākuta did by implying that he's untruthful. But
shame.
It doesn't stop
doesn't
stop Shane Jones from going on a massive, super insulting rant against Tākuta Whereas when it came to his turn to speak about the outcome of the Privileges Committee. And, you know, he's talking about how unparliamentarian it is, how rude it was of Tākuta Whereas to do it, even though A, he just did the exact same thing at the beginning of the day. And B, his comments that he uses are far more insulting. Like, I don't know the rules of Parliament, but they clearly don't make sense. Like, for example, he's speaking about Tākuta and he says, the complaint cannot deal with a deeper virus. The virus is that member. Day after day, swaggers and shows utter contempt, blah, 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 blah. Swaggers, of course, is a racialized term as well. So he's just compounding that. But just to call someone a virus.
No, that's awful. I
mean, I feel like that's worse than calling them a liar.
Totally.
But that's really normal run-of-the-day stuff for Shane Jones, that he just doesn't get called out on by his own parties or the media. Then he goes like on basically, I reckon, a giant projection rant against Tākuta Whereas. He tells him that he accuses Tākuta Whereas and the Māori Party of seeking to deploy and weaponize tikanga and Māori culture. And then he says that he's bringing shame to the long list of leaders who held this position in the Māori seat. And then he accuses Tākuta of not having humility. It's just funny. Each one of those cases, obviously, Shane Jones has no humility. He's one of the most arrogant people that you'll ever see. Obviously, he constantly weaponizes te ao Māori, Māori culture, against the interests of Māori and against the interests of people in this country. And I'll give a few examples of that. And even him saying that Tākuta is bringing shame on a long list of Māori leaders, I think that's coming from Shane Jones' own deep shame about himself and the legacy that he's leaving behind, because like he's really hated, you know. But yeah, in terms of examples of him weaponizing Māori, just from Parliament this week alone, he tells Māori that are fighting against the destruction of their environments to go back to the kumara vine and take responsibility for solving your own problems at the kitchen table. Extremely patronizing and extremely racist. You know, you got to sort your own problems at home before you can even tell us not to mine in your backyard. I mean, that's ridiculous. Then he says that the Maui dolphin doesn't exist.
Oh man, he keeps going.
Yeah, he's trying to be provocative.
Yeah.
So he says the Maui dolphin is a made-up animal, made-up dolphin. And then he says that, takes a jab, says where all the Māoris were fighting each other over the ownership quota. So, you know, again, another jab at Māori. And yeah, you get the idea. He just does this constantly. And so I just think it's hilarious that he accused Tākuta Whereas of all of the stuff that he does time and time again and he did just that week alone.
Similar strategy to David, yeah. Just be provocative as a distraction from the actual policies that they're trying to put through, is my interpretation of that.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, what does he actually want? And that's something that we're going to get into in this episode. What he wants, he explicitly says he wants to exploit Mother Nature's resources. And at one point he says to people who grow food that they should not be hobbled by unrealistic nutrient and water standards, reducing your ability to feed the citizens of New Zealand. Now, of course, there's a lot packed into that, like the fact that New Zealand growers, most of the stuff they're growing is going overseas. They're not even having to do this to feed New Zealanders. They can be way below the nutrient and water standards if they've simply farmed for just New Zealand. The only reason our environmental destruction is happening is because we're having to export so much of our food. And finally, on my Parliament Unpack, one thing that I found interesting is, you know, they're always co-opting language. That's like their favorite thing to do.
Yep.
At the moment, you know, they're going with this language of growth.
Right.
Growth, market economy growth.
Green shoots.
Yes, but they're trying to twist it into like green, earthy language.
Like an ecosystem, the market ecosystem.
Yes, actually, Luxon referred to the marketplace and the economy as an ecosystem. At other times, they said that, you know, the economic seeds are germinating and buds are developing. And so, yeah, they're trying to, I don't know if greenwash is the right thing, but it's just co-opting our language, saying that when we use these language about ecosystems and protecting our environment, it's lame, woke, and losery. But if they use it to describe the economy, it's rational and enlightened and civilized.
It has to be framed in in terms of marketing. Like you can be woke and you can do karakia and speak te reo Māori and do all of these things if it is for a marketing purpose, if it's for money, if you're selling something. But if you're just doing karakia and embracing those kind of things just for yourself, just because it makes you feel good and it's the right thing to do, woke.
Yeah. And that's it for my Parliament Unpack this week.
Well done.
Thanks.
I'm looking forward to
for joining us for our first segment.
The regulars. Excellent. Okay, kapai. So today I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to start with the recent polls that have been coming out. So you can see it in Labour, right? They're getting excited. They're like more smiley and more like bright, interesting, fun, vibrant kind of stuff being on their social media. So the left bloc, not just the Varian poll, has shown that the left bloc can form a government if we were to run a snap election right now. But also the Curia poll. And I'm keen to talk about Curia because Curia Market Research, it is affiliated with the ACT Party. And I use the term affiliated loosely. The connection between Curia Market Research and the ACT Party is David Farrar, who, along with Jordan Williams, started the Taxpayers Union. And the Taxpayers Union, they have all sorts of connections with the ACT Party, of course, but like David Seymour and the ACT Party, Jordan Williams from the Taxpayers Union and the Taxpayers Union themselves are a part of the Atlas network. They've all received funding and they've gone to their conferences and of course they align on policies, free market, neoliberal capitalism. That's their shtick. So I bring up Curia Market Research because it's good for us to know about the connections that all of these groups have. Another poll that I'll just touch on briefly was the poll from the Human Rights Commission that talks about how the majority of people in Aotearoa do believe in respectful dialogue around te tiriti o Waitangi, and how here in Aotearoa we do believe in respectful relationships, and that through honouring te tiriti, it's something that's helpful for us to get there in terms of living in respectful relationships with one another. So, you know, we see all sorts of things, narrative and things that really make us feel like it's hard at the moment and that the world is against us. But as you can see from the poll here from the Human Rights Commission, things aren't as bad as some people might make it out to be. And so to bring us back to Curia Market Research, they have had multiple complaints upheld against them because of breaching professional standards in terms of how they have done their research and how they've framed questions in some of their polls. And the media still publishes Curia polls, though. Like, I find it quite interesting. RANZ, the Research Association of New Zealand, they are the only organization of their type that tries to uphold or help polling companies maintain professional standards. When RANZ upheld these two complaints against Curia, David Farrar, who started Curia, he received an email from RANZ. RANZ said that they were looking to potentially suspend or reprimand Curia, which I guess would have put a black mark against their name. So instead of going through that process, David Farrar resigned Curia from RANZ. So, you know, RANZ would give Curia legitimacy. But because Curia has been going for so long, I'll just pull up their client base here. Look at their clients here. They've been going for so long. They don't need these groups that give them legitimacy in terms of upholding standards and whatnot. Because look at who their customers are. The National Party, Pfizer, oh boy, Microsoft, Bill Gates, Big Daddy Colonizer, liquor lobby groups, the supermarket duopoly, pharmaceuticals. You know, it's really it's quite daunting. But this is why they don't need the RANZ legitimacy behind their name, because look at the kinds of clients that these guys pursue. They're not necessarily into, you know, I would say, necessarily, got to be careful with your words these days, eh? That Curia isn't necessarily about creating ethical and professional polls. They'll just be doing whatever these guys want to chase customers for these really huge globalized corporate entities. So, a polling company that is linked with the ACT Party. What are a few things that they can do that might
sway public opinion?
Exactly. What can they do? Well, David Farrar wrote a blog post, and in this blog post, he talked about how Brooke Van Velden, how he believes that that when Curia polled for Brooke Van Velden, that he actually thinks that it helped her to get the momentum that she needed to win that seat. when they polled for her, she was just 2% behind who was leading. And so, you know, when you see a poll like that, people who believe in Brooke Van Velden, they would have thought, oh, look, she's got a chance. So maybe it is a good idea to try vote for her. So there weren't many polls of the electorate seats. No one was really doing polls except for Curia, because they have the money to be able to do something like that. So from David Farrer's perspective, it was the simple fact that they ran a poll at the right time, which helped Brooke Van Velden to win her seat. And it's another thing about polling is that there is no guarantee, there's no need, there's no onus on the creator of the poll to actually post those results. So you can pay for a poll.
Right.
Like, they are expensive.
Exactly.
They're expensive, so people will say that, oh, they wouldn't do that. But when money is the only thing in the way of these guys publishing polls, then I am sure, I'm happy to make a bet that this is something that they do. There is a margin of error in these polls. So you can run multiple polls, and then whichever one, ends up on that higher side of the margin for error, that's the poll that you're going to go with.
That's a really big part of it. And the news does that as well. The news polls people more often than we know, and they'll just release it if they like the outcome or it suits some kind of story. And, along those same lines, the questions that they ask in these polls is also extremely important. Like,
Definitely.
often, like, I remember during the Kitty Allen times, they put in questions in their polls specifically about Kitty Allen, like why? Like, are they now putting in polls people's opinions about David Seymour and Jago? They won't do that, right? So it's the questions also frame the outcome.
Yeah, and so the framing of the questions, that was one of the things that Curia got pulled up for in one of these upheld complaints. They didn't frame the question in a way that would ensure an unbiased response. That was what Rands brought up in terms of one of the complaints. And when you think about that in our country, referendums, polling people on how they feel about, let's say, the Treaty Principles Bill. I know Curia did a poll for the Treaty Principles Bill, and you'd have to look at the exact wording of how they worded it. So, this is the theme that I think is really interesting. All of these groups have to really twist the narrative. Taxpayers Union, the ACT Party, Curia, all of these groups who are chasing this narrative of how these things are fighting race-based privileges. This is their whole strategy. They need to twist the narrative because they have no real argument. Let's keep moving on, because this is some of the things that I was going to bring up and I'm getting distracted. So this is the one here of how Rands was talking about how the wording of Curia's questions didn't bring about unbiased results. Another thing to highlight the manipulation that goes on in their corridor. Jordan Williams from the Taxpayers Union, I don't think these guys should be interviewed by the media, with everything that has gone wrong with these groups.
And their links with the government, they're clearly biased.
Yeah.
But just simply because the Taxpayers Union used the Curia poll, now the news is using that as an excuse to bring in Jordan Williams as some sort of expert on the topic, even though he's a biased lobbyist. He's not an independent expert on polling.
Exactly. So they bring him in to get his opinion about the poll because of his connection with Curia. And of course, along with it, we get all of his sneaky, he is a slippery Savaloy, this Jordan Williams character. So let's have a listen to this interview. Corin is asking Jordan why he thinks National is struggling at the moment. And I did not expect to hear this take from Jordan. I think it's really interesting. I'll play it, then we'll talk about
it. Stupid. Do you think that it's just that they are the incumbent, that this is a direct result of the weak economy? The unemployment rate, of course, is lagging and now starting to spike up. That is the sole main reason for this?
Well, yeah. I mean, the vast majority of people are telling pollsters that the issue is jobs and the economy.
That's not me saying that. That's what the data shows. The other thing that's quite interesting is the last sort of strong poll for the government in December was post the hikoi and the like, which would suggest that the issue around, or the noise around treaty principles, is not so much the treaty principles issue, but the problem for the government is it's very difficult for it to get its economic message through to the public when all the noise is around treaty principles. Look at,
So I thought that was really quite interesting. It's not that he's lost popularity because he's enabling the most racist play, probably one of the most racist plays that this government has ever made, and he's doing nothing about it. He's letting his coalition partners just, run a complete muck. All of this division in our communities, and that's what Jordan Williams thinks is distracting everyone from National's incredible policies around the economy.
I have seen this narrative pop up recently from quite a few places, not just these lobbyists, but from various journalists. And I think it's hilarious because they are actually inverting reality.
Yeah.
So they're saying that the Treaty Principles Bill is distracting the public from the amazing things National is doing, when in fact, I believe that National is using the Treaty Principles Bill and David Seymour as a clown act in general to distract the public from all the horrible things that they're doing to workers, to the environment, to vulnerable people in the country. So it's funny that they've flipped that and they've been like, oh, it is a distraction, but from the good stuff.
Yeah, classic. And now here's another comment that I thought was really quite telling of Jordan Williams and the whole way that they frame this discussion around the Treaty Principles Bill.
We're able to gain from the economic return. What is particularly worrying for this government is, I'd argue, particularly last budget, they wasted.
But one of the problems for Christopher Luxon seems to be, and we sort of alluded to this earlier on with the Treaty Principles Bill, he's being sidetracked from his key messages, or is he, do you believe, because of the issues around David Seymour, who's we've talked a lot about this morning. Then there's also the New Zealand First and its particular hobby horses that it's railing. They are getting a lot of attention. And is that hurting the overall government result because Luxon is not able to get his message across effectively?
Yes and no. Yes, very clearly, as I was saying earlier, the noise around treaty principles, for which the public, for some people is a very important issue. Personally, I consider it a huge threat to our long-term prosperity, the issue of race-based privilege. However, for the...
It's almost like he's like, oh yeah, I agree with everybody. Yeah, it's controversial, it's tricky. But then he twists it. When he says that the Treaty Principles Bill is about addressing race-based privileges, what he is saying is that is the design of the bill, to end race-based privileges. But the reality here in Aotearoa, of course, which is just evident by the disproportionate negative statistics that Māori suffer from, the reality here in Aotearoa is that we do currently have race-based privilege, but it's not towards Māori, evident in our statistics. But I just think it's such a manipulative thing for him to frame it like that. But it's consistent. All of them do it. We see it from the ACT Party, of course, as well. You go on their treaty website, and all of their branding and everything about it, of course, is about equal rights for all, which of course is implying that we don't currently have equal rights, that this bill is going to bring about equal rights. But all of the things that have been introduced to fix these disparities towards te iwi Māori, through this bill, those things are being removed. And so those disparities are not resolved. And so what the Treaty Principles Bill does is it is cementing the current systems of race-based privilege in this country, the exact opposite of what they are claiming. And it's that's just another thing about this ACT Party treaty website that I find quite funny, is that you look at it and not a single link on this website will send you to the actual text of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. So of course it's just all their narrative, not a single link, which I think is really quite telling. And so let's get into a bit of this race-based privilege kind of talk. The main thing that really annoyed the racists, from my perspective, is when Nanaia Mahuta removed an incredibly racist, she fixed an incredibly racist bill. The bill that she amended enabled the public to essentially, they had to run a petition to get 5% of the public who agreed to run a referendum to disestablish a Māori ward. So this bill has in it a function for the public to overturn a council's decision through a referendum to have a Māori ward. And it kind of doesn't sound too bad. You know, they're like, oh, they're organising, running polls, doing a referendum to decide if a council should have a Māori ward. But then you learn that that function only exists for Māori wards. Only exists for Māori wards. And a council can create a ward for whatever demographic they want, like a rural ward, for example. A lot of councils have a rural ward. There is no way for citizens to initiate a referendum to overturn that ward. That functionality has only existed for Māori wards. And of course, Māori wards are there to try and help Māori have more say in governance, which is just, it's not honouring Te Tiriti, but it's a stepping stone towards fixing the fact that we have been locked out of these decision-making spaces for a long time. So Nanaia tried to fix that, and I think that was a really great thing that she did. But this really, really triggered all of the racists. I mean, of course, when National came in, they said that they were going to reverse what Nanaia had done, so bring back in this racist clause that allows people to remove Māori wards. And it was in, of course, the New Zealand First and ACT Party coalition agreements as well. And, for me, they're trying to keep this discussion around Te Tiriti and around colonisation in that space of identity politics. They just want to talk about race and blood and, oh, you're doing that because you think you're special by virtue of having Māori blood. Mm-hmm. But the real reason of why we do these things is because of Crown obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, actual legal contractual obligations. That's why we do these things. It's not because of some, because you have a touch of Māori blood in you. It has nothing to do with ancestry. It has nothing to do, and I say this very carefully, it has nothing to do with whakapapa when you think about it. It has to do with a specific justice claim of Te Tiriti being breached and for the government to then fix their breach. A crime has been done to te iwi Māori, and then it's up to the Crown to remedy that situation. That is why these guys say that they're tough on crime, right? The Crown is the biggest criminal that there is. But of course, it's all just empty rhetoric. The reason why I believe they try to keep us in that space of talking about race and skin color and those petty kind of things is because there is a real power that Māori have here in Aotearoa, that all of us have here if we can build a movement behind Māori sovereignty. It's not just for Māori, right? It's for all of us. When we think about Ihu Mātao, for example, and I'm sure that pissed off a lot of the racists, Māori occupied the whenua, okay? Because we know our rights. We know what we believe in. We know our stories. We wanted to protect the whenua. And the government had to strike a deal. They had to buy the land back because Māori weren't leaving. And so, of course, for a developer, that's a real pain in the ass. They have to change their plans. They have to find a new, place to colonize. And this is a consistent thing that Māori have been doing for a really long time. Land occupations, they're incredibly powerful and they get things done. And the reason why they're powerful is because of the story of our indigeneity and our connection to Aotearoa. And they're wanting to diminish from that. Just talking about...
From the story?
Yeah. Because we are indigenous to Aotearoa and we have things like Te Tiriti o Waitangi, these contractual obligations that the Crown is tied to, that, for me personally, that gives me the confidence to know that I can stand pretty much anywhere in Aotearoa where I know I have connection, and many of us do. And mana whenua is what I'm talking about. Mana whenua have the ultimate authority. And it's only through understanding our history and understanding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, understanding our indigeneity to this land, that we're able to have that strong belief. And through that strong belief, we're able to stand proud and tall to do things like land occupations that lead to the Crown actually turning things around. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. A lot of the land occupations that have taken place, they wouldn't be possible if we didn't have our connection in terms of our indigeneity in the back of our minds when we're doing these kinds of things. So that story, that beauty of indigeneity and the Crown's obligations to respect our aspirations because of Te Tiriti o Waitangi is an incredibly powerful thing. So instead, they just try to make it about race relations and race-based privileges, race-based preferences, which I think is just a joke. So moving on. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is the Ngāi Tahu court case that's happening down in Te Waipounamu.
So good.
Now, of course, without Te Tiriti, without our understanding of our connection to the whenua, things like this wouldn't be possible. So not only do we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi that backs us up for things like this, but it's that knowing. It's the knowing of our indigeneity that I think gives our people the pride and the strength to be able to do these things. And so, if you don't know, like you were mentioning it before in terms of the harms that agriculture does to our country, our waterways are essentially treated like sewers in this country. And Ngāi Tahu, they have settled, right? People understand that they've gone through a settlement process. In their settlement process, the Crown has acknowledged their rangatiratanga, their chieftainship, their authority over their taonga, which includes waterways, within their boundaries, their takiwa. So within their settlement, they have acknowledged Ngāi Tahu's authority. Not only that, but in their formal Crown apology to Ngāi Tahu, again, they reiterated the acknowledgement of Ngāi Tahu's rangatiratanga. So we have Te Tiriti, we have their settlement, and we have the formal apology. And in this court case, there are a lot of big names. There are a lot of big names involved. Chris Finlayson, who is a previous Attorney General and was a previous Minister for Treaty of Waitangi negotiations for national. So from that perspective, national perspective, he's probably like a kupapa, really. Chris Finlayson has been such a champion for Māori rights. And I think what happened for him is, he spent so much time with Māori. Through his engagement with Māori as Minister of Treaty Negotiations, he started to understand Māori. And I think it's just a beautiful thing. It's one of those examples of when you spend enough time in these spaces and around people you might disagree with, beautiful things can happen just through sharing space.
And they've gone and probably replaced all of the normal human beings in their parties to just have sociopaths, because how can you spend time with an iwi or hapu or community who tells you about their struggles and how they've been dispossessed from the land and all that they've lost without undergoing some sort of emotional transformation? The only explanation is that the rest of them are sociopaths or psychopaths.
Absolutely. And now I'm just going to go back to, I was talking about race and all of those kinds of things. This here is Te Maire. He is one of the main claimants of the Ngāi Tahu case. And this is his perspective on race. It's a short clip.
Now, this whole idea of race, we know, is genetically meaningless. It has no basis in science, but it's reproduced as a meme all the time in society. Another fact I want...
So just that, he's a historian, by the way. And for me, it's just reinforcing this idea. It's not about race. It's not about blood. It's about a specific justice claim. So the waterways in Te Waipounamu, in Ngāi Tahu's Takiwa, they've been decimated. Te Waihora, I think, is Lake Ellesmere. In 2011, it was New Zealand's most polluted lake. And it used to be one of the biggest eel fisheries, I believe, in Aotearoa, in the whole country. But by 2011, it's become New Zealand's most polluted lake. I don't know if it's still the most polluted lake, but it was in that time. And so the Crown has failed. The Crown has failed in terms of their obligations to look after waterways. Oh, that's right. Here we go. So yeah, Te Waihora, one of the most polluted lakes in New Zealand. Another person involved in the Ngāi Tahu case is Mike Joy, who you showed briefly the information about waterways and whatnot. Mike Joy wrote this really awesome article here, and in it he details how Environment Canterbury, ECAN, they were looking at options to clean up the lake. And essentially they boiled it down to two potential options to try and clean up this lake. One of the options was to create a wetland. To create a wetland, which would be a one-off cost of about 380 million. One-off cost of 380 million to install a wetland. The other option was for a loss of revenue of 250 million yearly. And that involved just getting the dairy farmers to farm less. Now, this is quite a lot of money, 250 million yearly. Obviously the smart option is the 380 million to just set up the wetland. But what ECAN decided to do was nothing. They did neither, because they deemed that both of the options that they were looking into were too expensive. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the Crown being responsible to look after these things. Their priorities are not there. For me, this is why it's important that Māori are in governance positions. Just to go on a bit of a yarn, tangata whenua, land people or people of the land, tangata whenua. Now, I'm generalizing here, but just look at our origin stories and the way that we introduce ourselves through our pepeha, things like that. The stories that we tell our children tie us to the natural world. You talk to a Māori child who's going to kura kaupapa, and they will be able to tell you stories about rangi nui and papatuanuku and how literally we connect via whakapapa genetically to them. So from a young age, we're teaching our children that we are literally part of the natural world. And so for me, the rights of tangata whenua can be seen as a proxy for the rights of the taiao. When our rights are protected, so too are the rights of the natural world. Because for te iwi Māori, we see ourselves as one. And I think we all need to kind of adopt that view. I think it's a beautiful type of view. It's the kind of priority that we need. And of course, not all of us have that perspective, but because of the stories that we tell ourselves and in our pepeha, the way that we reference our landscapes and things like that, I think it's beautiful aspects about that from Te Ao Māori that would be so valuable for a lot of our politicians to take on, and for it to really be embedded in the type of culture that we have here in Aotearoa.
Kia ora.
It's a dream, it's a hope. And another thing as well, talking about these councils, if you look at this graph here, we barely ever get over 50% turnout at local elections. It's shocking. It's crazy. And, think about central government. They set up the rules. But then we've got local government. They are the ones who are actually doing the implementing. So the rules are set up, but then these are the guys who implement things. we always get so distracted, I think, by the general elections that we forget local elections.
Very important.
You know, and of course, local elections, they benefit, or there's a preference there, of course, for those who are currently in power, the status quo power demographic, the rich land-owning class. And the way that local elections benefits them, there's the small thing, which is like, you know, voting is done by a post box. So if you have a fixed physical address, it's going to benefit you as opposed to someone who might be transient, you know, living between addresses. You may not give so much of a damn about a random letter that you receive. But another thing, of course, which shouldn't be news to people watching this, is that if you own properties in multiple electorates, then you get a vote in each of those electorates.
Special rights.
It is. It really is it's a special right. It's a class right. You know, we do have a system of prioritizing certain demographics in Aotearoa, and it's to prioritize the upper class. You can see it reflected in all of our laws, and this is a prime one. You have more decision-making power based on the amount of properties that you own, as long as they're in different electorates.
It's outrageous.
Outrageum. Okay, so next. Well, I should just wrap that one up because that moved on too quickly. But so the Ngāi Tahu water court case is an incredibly important one. It's going to be a very long court case, and it has the potential to set a precedent for the rest of the country, for the rest of the iwi around the country, in terms of what we potentially need to do, depending on the outcome of this court case. It's likely to go for years. So we'll try to keep everybody updated on it. I think it's an incredibly important one in terms of the precedent that it can set. But, you know, it's one of those things that's really expensive. Ngāi Tahu has settled, and they are one of the richest iwi. They are the richest. I'm pretty sure Ngāti Whātua might be close, but no, I'm pretty sure Ngāi Tahu is the richest iwi. So it's a shame. Again, there is unfortunately, you have to have money to get these kinds of things done. So, you know, money talks. Money really does talk. So another thing that's come up recently, National wants to change our GE laws.
Genetic engineering. Genetic
engineering, yes. And, you know, it should scare people what's coming. I mean, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but, you know, what is the purpose of GE? For me, I believe it's just so that we can keep kicking the can down the road, you know, like ECAN with that previous lake. They come up with these plans. They say that there's something that they've got in the pipeline to work on these things, but then they don't implement it. GE is potentially one of that. It's not a guaranteed technology that could be helpful. One of the things that I thought was really interesting from Judith Collins is that one of her talking points is that we're bringing in new GE laws for medicines to make different types of medicines more available for patients here in Aotearoa. Right. But for me, that's the distraction aspect. You know, Luxon and others in their communications have been more clear that this is really about farmers. You know, the farming lobby is the farming entities here, and the farming lobby, they're the most powerful lobbying group, I would say, in Aotearoa. And you mentioned it, you know, our primary exports, the primary thing that we export is dairy. It is, as they say, the backbone of the New Zealand economy. You know, despite the fact that the dairy industry is $36.8 billion in debt. And I'll take my hat off a little bit. The last time I looked at the figure, it was 40 billion. So they've made some progress, but $36.8 billion in debt, and we still call them the backbone of the economy. But, you know, it's a silver bullet type of approach, this genetic engineering. You know, what are they trying to do? They're trying to change the gut microbiome, because it's, you know, cows are ruminant animals, and it's through that rumination that gases are created. So they're playing with their genes, changing their feed to try and get a different result. But of course, you know, when you change something, you put weight on somewhere, you know, it expresses itself elsewhere. So I have no faith whatsoever in their pursuits. I think it's a complete waste of time. Of course, environmentally, it's like a nightmare in terms of what it could open up. You know, when you introduce a new species, something that's genetically engineered or otherwise, you know, we haven't learned our lesson, you know, already, the amount of introduced species that we've brought here. And now, you know, we have to murder them by the millions, the billions, you know, these poor creatures that we've brought here. And now, because of our hubris, we torture them to death. And I think, you know, that brings up another point about GE. When it comes to applying it to agriculture, there is a lot of animal testing that is going to have to take place. But that's something I'll talk a bit about that later. Another thing that Judith Collins has talked about is that we are behind other countries in terms of, you know, they've got more progressed GE laws than us. But I think it was Deborah from the Labour Party. She pointed out that the environmental aspects of what National is wanting to do is going to take us beyond what any other country that we compare ourselves to, like Australia. It's going to take us beyond the types of things that they've done. So lots of distraction, lots of, you know, narrative-based stuff.
So we're going to potentially be a testing ground for new agriculture-related, genetically engineered things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely, definitely. We're already, you know, Ag Research, which is a Crown Research Institute, so it's government funded. For over a decade now, they've been researching a particular type of ryegrass. And, you know, so even though we have these laws that have stopped them from being able to implement it and test it out in the field, they've been working on this for a really long time.
In preparation?
Yeah. And because they've been working on it, they've been able to tell us, you know, hey, there's something coming, there's something in the works. It's really scary. But it's just, for me, it's that kicking the can down the road type of thing. You know, they've been telling us for a long time that Ag Research is working on this ryegrass. It's going to be great, but it's still all completely untested science. They're relying on being able to meet climate goals and all of these other things through really like fairy tale level genetic engineering. Like the types of things that this genetically engineered ryegrass is, the hope that they're putting into this ryegrass is really just insane. So, you know, they keep telling us that we need to trust them, that they're going to come up with a solution, right? But this is the kind of solution that they're coming up with, these ryegrasses.
I mean, the industry's not going to put itself out of business, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they keep trying to make us believe that that's what they're going to do.
So in terms of what Ag Research has said is possible for this ryegrass that they've produced, and I don't have the stats here, my apologies, but in terms of emissions, they're predicting potentially a 10 to 15% reduction in emissions. Now,
from the ryegrass?
Yeah. If the cow is just eating this genetically engineered ryegrass and they've controlled everything else, they are predicting a 10 to 15% reduction in methane. Now, we've signed up to the Global Methane Pledge, I believe it is. I've lost my notes here, but we've signed up to what's called the Global Methane Pledge. And they are looking for a 30% reduction by 2020, a global reduction of 30% by 2020.
2030?
2030, yeah, sorry. In 5 years, they're looking for a 30% global reduction of methane. So this ryegrass that we're talking about, we don't even know if it's going to work. It hasn't even been fed to an animal in the kinds of conditions that we have here in Aotearoa. So it's a completely unproven type of science, type of thing that they're pursuing. And it's not even going to be enough to meet this global methane target that we've signed ourselves up to. So it's just a complete joke. And not only that, but, you know, my main thing is waterways. The reduction that they're expecting in terms of nitrates from cattle urine, which is If not the main problem, it's one of the main problems in terms of our water pollution. They're expecting a 5 to 6% decrease in the amount of nitrogen that is leached from cattle urine. 5 to 6%. For the lake Te Waihora, the council was saying that every dairy farm would have to shut down in that area for that lake to reach proper drinking water standards. So this 5 to 6% reduction is just a complete joke. And, you know, the reason why they're running with this GE technology is primarily around emissions. Primarily around emissions. Now, we are getting poisoned waterways here. People's drinking water is becoming contaminated. But the thing that is making our dairy sector move is not what's going on here locally. The thing that's making them move is that Nestle, probably Fonterra's biggest company, has set targets for their suppliers. So Fonterra supplying Nestle, they have their goals. If they don't meet those goals, then they can risk losing their contract with Nestle. So that is the thing that has got Fonterra moving. Not the fact that we're poisoning people here in Aotearoa. Like, farmers are being poisoned. If you're living in a catchment that is intensively farmed by dairy, I'm looking for the story here. There is an increased risk for colorectal cancer for farmers. You try to find me this story about colorectal cancer. So if you're living in a intensively farmed dairy area and you're drinking from groundwater, which a lot of people do, they have wells that brings water up, and that's how they get their drinking water. It has been shown that there is a correlation with colorectal cancer based on levels of nitrates, certain amounts of nitrates in our waters, and the level that's associated with this colorectal risk is really quite low, really low. I don't have the numbers, sorry, but it's about 0.8%, I think, which is where people are starting to see an association with colorectal cancer. The standard that we have here in Aotearoa for what is considered the allowable amount of nitrates in drinking water is like 11 milligrams. And that is an insanely high amount. Here we go. Sorry, it took me so long to find it. So the amount that we allow of nitrates in our water is 11 milligrams. There we go. And we have that level set at 11 milligrams because that level is associated with blue baby syndrome. But the amount that has been shown to be associated with colorectal cancer is 0.87 milligrams. And what some people have been finding in their drinking water has been as high as around 4, 6, 7%. Greenpeace have been going around the country and testing people's water. So, and these people that are potentially getting sick and at risk of colorectal cancer are the farmers. You know, this happens in highly intensive dairy farmed areas. And of course, those people are the farmers. They're the farmers themselves. And so the priorities of Fonterra and our dairy industry is not even their own farmers. It's not even their own people. It's simply these, you know, globalist elites who are dictating to them how they have to farm, which is, you know, it's sad. It's very sad. And of course, you know, with this shift in GE, our companies that run off of this clean, green, GE-free branding are set potentially to lose billions of dollars. There was this report that was commissioned by Organics Aotearoa, New Zealand. They commissioned the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, and it was estimated a potential $10 to $20 billion of harm could come from going down this route of introducing genetically engineered organisms into our environment. And of course, this is the exact opposite direction that we need to be going. And people will remember maybe a few years ago, all of the talk was about regenerative agriculture. That was the path that everyone was trying to send us down. And what is regenerative agriculture? It's permaculture. It's closed loop systems, completely sustainable. This is going to take us down the further industrial route. And so, our small scale family farms, if there are any of them left, they will be pulling out what is left of their hair because of things like this. The trajectory of our primary sector has not slowed down, and this is just going to supercharge it.
It's been this trajectory the entire time of adding extra inputs to farming, and farmers having to, whether it's fertilizer or whatever, irrigation, having to add extra inputs into their farm so that they can create more products so that giant corporations like Fonterra can export it and make giant profits. But in the process, small-time farmers that can't afford irrigators, that can't afford giant amount of fertilizer, and in this case can't afford to bring genetically engineered microorganisms into their farm, they're going to fall behind. And it's been like this the whole time, and you can see the numbers of cows have exploded as a result over the past 50 years.
Like, I will need to look at the numbers, but we used to have more dairy cows than human beings. I think the herd has come down a little bit now, and maybe our human population has gone up, but we roughly have the same amount of dairy cows as we do human beings. And a dairy cow produces about 14 times the waste equivalent of a single adult human. Okay? And so, like, when you were talking before, we've lost 90% of our wetlands. The wetlands are the kidneys of our ecosystems that filter water. Like when we take a shit, it goes down the toilet, or for us, it goes into the compost. But when a cow takes a shit, because of the loss of all of those wetlands and those natural systems, they're just directly sending their waste. And of course, it's not the cow's fault. It's the farming system's fault. But a whole lot of waste. And what we talked about, these GE silver bullet fixes in terms of that nitrates, the nitrogen in the urine, only a 5 to 6% reduction. 5 to 6% reduction. When you think about these people that have nitrates in their water, in their drinking water, and the colorectal association that they have, a 5 to 6% reduction in those nitrates is sadly not going to do anything.
Well, that's the thing. They're not trying to resolve the water quality issue at all. They've completely erased that from the narrative, and now they're just trying to deal with emissions and not doing a good job of that either. But one thing that's really important to us is that we remind them constantly that it's not just about emissions. It's actually about local issues happening right here on our land, in our waterways, on our soil. So even if they found the magic bullet to just absorb all the emissions in a machine in the sky, we would still have poisoned waters. That's why we think we should focus on asking for clean water and go back to the basics like that. Because it's easier for them to manipulate the climate discussion. It's easier for them to say, oh, we're going to apply this fantastical mathematics and you won't know what hit you. But by the end of it, you're going to see that we're dealing with the issue somehow. You can't mathematics your way out of poisoned water. It's either clean or it's not. You can either swim in it or you can't.
And another thing, we mentioned it before, but the animal testing aspect of GE in agriculture is a scary thing. Now, we already do all sorts of really fucked up kinds of tests to cows as it is. Without the genetic engineering, there's all sorts of weird things that we do. We cut holes in the side of cows so that we can reach into their ruminant system to pull things out, to analyze their stomach content and all sorts of things like that. But, we have actually had some GE or transmugenic, I'm not sure exactly how they word it, but we have actually had some animals in Aotearoa where genetic engineering has been tested. And so this report here that I've just pulled up, GE animals in New Zealand, which was done by GE Free NZ, I think about 10 years ago or so, it details all of the really awful things that have happened to animals in labs. You know, being born without organs, literal organs that have been missing or have problems. No bladder. Some have been born without a bladder. Deformities of all sorts. Limbs that have been fused together. And, you know, these are the kinds of things that we are going to have to pay for if we go down this route of playing God. And that's really what this is if we go down this route of genetic engineering. And I know that, you know, some people will say, oh, it can be done safely. It's blah, 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 blah. But, you know, the lives that we're going to bring into this world and then torture and then destroy in the pursuit of this type of technology, I think is unethical. I think it's, you know, no matter how great your final product is, if we have to lose some of our humanity to get there, then I don't think it's worth it. And it's those types of truths that we don't tell about the agricultural sector, you know, the backbone of our economy. Those types of things that I think is forcing us to lose our humanity. And this is just going to cement our pathway in terms of going down that route. You know, all of these things are going to happen in labs. None of us is really going to know what's going on. Everything is going to have to be OIA'd. Hidden camera investigations are going to have to be done. And like I said, it's for the tiniest little minuscule, again, reductions that in the long term aren't going to bring about any meaningful change.
It's back to that discussion about hiding the ugliness, right? We talked about Chris Bishop thinking that poorer countries desecrate their environments. We, of course, desecrate the lives of other animals and perform all sorts of horrible animal testing already. But yeah, when they talk about this program, they make it sound so wonderful and amazing and innovative, and we're going to have technology, we're going to protect the environment, it's going to be green, it's going to be, you know, ecosystems of growth or whatever. And the reality, as you've just talked about it, is this absolute horrific nightmare. And that's just, you know, classic capitalism, right? To alienate us from the actual processes that take place and to instead sell us a product that at this stage doesn't even resemble at all what we're being told it is.
So submissions are still open. E hoa mā. If you want to submit against the GE bill that National Act and New Zealand First are wanting to bring in, there are a million reasons, right? I think the main reason for a lot of people is that there's no going back once you go down that pathway. Once we bring in this alien, introduced genetically engineered substance into our natural ecosystem, there's no going back. Like, just think about what it could potentially do to the rabbit population in Aotearoa. We're already growing, you know, the rabbit's favorite food, and now we have what some people would say like plague levels of rabbits around the country. They are going to be eating this, then they are going to be spreading it around everywhere. If you're a farmer who wants to be GE free, you're going to have to pay extra money to get that GE free certification. And there's going to be all of these animals running around your property, insects carrying around these GE substances, I'll call them, along with them, and it's going to be contaminating everything. It's going to be a pathway that we cannot reverse once we go there. And, you know, of course, it is a huge breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And this is another example of how Māori need to be consulted on these things as a backstop. It buys us time. It gives us time. If we put, you know, it's seen as red tape by the government, you know, consulting with Māori. It's seen as red tape. But, you know, some red tape is necessary. Without Te Tiriti o Waitangi being honoured in this regard, Māori being consulted on bringing GE into the country, that removes one of the safeguards that we have as a people here in Aotearoa. To buy us time so that we can have more insights, so there can be more engagement, more submissions, so that the media can learn more about it and can teach people about it. But without honouring Te Tiriti, it's just like the fast track. Straight through the red tape. Just because they want to turn a profit. The fast tracking of our country. The selling the commercialization of papatūānuku.
And just to clarify, because some of the comments, selective breeding is not what we're talking about. There are some examples of genetically modified organisms in the country, but only a couple of specific ones. For example, in cheese, it's called rennet.
Rennet. Yes.
That is genetically modified and it's added to cheese. And so people have used the argument before, we already have some genetically modified organisms. But as Pere said, this bill doesn't just open it up to things like that. It opens it up even beyond what other countries have done and will turn us into a testing ground for riskier things other than these tried microorganisms. But it is worth mentioning that if you have an issue with genetically engineered microorganisms, you might want to take a look at cheese.
Yep. There are a few other things like in the medical space. There are a lot of like insulin, I think, is a genetically engineered. We used to get it from pigs. We used to take insulin from pigs, but now it's created completely artificially. I think through a genetically engineered process, but I would need to look at that one. I think it's an incredibly important thing for us to be aware of. But primarily, I just see it as another way for our agricultural sector to just keep kicking the can down the road. Like people think, oh, well, didn't we reel them back in through the emissions trading scheme? Isn't there something that we've used to, bring agricultural emissions, to tax them or something? But no, the emissions trading scheme gave an exemption for dairy, even though dairy are our biggest, source of emissions. They got a huge exemption from the emissions trading scheme. And now, of course, what National and Act and New Zealand First have done when they got into government was they ensured that agricultural emissions would never be charged through the emissions trading scheme. And now, instead of that, they've got this alternative program that the industry is designing. So the industry, of course, is going to be policing their own emissions.
It's just constant delay tactics, and they're not even using good promises to delay us. It's like even the promises that they make are empty, but it's just always delay on top of delay on top of delay.
Yep. All right. I think that's the end of my segment. So we've still got a bit to go through, e hoa ma. I think it's about time that we took a break, though. I'm like losing my notes. So we're going to take 5, just get a glass of water and change the battery on our camera. So kia u tonu mai. Learned that one from One News. Stay tuned. Kia ora tātou. We're back.
Kia ora, kia ora. Welcome back, everyone.
All right. So what's our next segment?
Okay, so next we're going to be talking about how the government is trying to accelerate the sale of New Zealand's environment and our land. It's of course been the normal colonial trajectory for the last 200 years, but this government is accelerating it, and they're being very blatant about their intention to do so. First up, we've got golden visas. So they're essentially selling the ability to buy residency for $5 million as one option, and you only need to spend 21 days here for 3 years. They also removed the test for English language, and in an interview, Erica Stanford said they did this because investors found the English language test insulting, which is hilarious because obviously they don't find it insulting for every other person applying for residency. They don't find it insulting that we have an immigration system that is akin to modern slavery. They don't find it insulting that, in the words of Bernard Hickey, New Zealand immigration laws allowed fraudulent agents and fly-by-night firms to bring in desperate and poor workers with suggestions of high-paid jobs and residency, only to pull the rug out from under their feet and leaving them indebted and even more desperate. There's so much to say about immigration policy, and we will one day do an in-depth episode on it, but just to quickly give you an idea of how bad it is, it was made even worse by Labour in their last term when they brought in the accredited visa scheme. The accredited visa scheme created a black market where effectively dodgy agents would buy these tokens, they called them tokens, and then sell them at a really high price to vulnerable people. And often they would come to New Zealand and not even find a job, or they would have a job, but the company would liquidate. And by the way, for some reason, if a company liquidates and you are a migrant on a migrant visa and you lose your job as a result, it's not considered exploitation. So companies do this all the time. They're about to liquidate. They bring a whole bunch of migrant workers. Then they shut up shop because they have no money and they don't have to pay them the last 10 weeks pay or whatever it is. So they get all that free labor and there's nothing for the migrant workers to do. And of course, there's the fact that the visa is tied to the employer. So if your employer abuses you, there's a really high chance that you'll put up with it because you don't want to lose your visa and you might not be able to find a different job to link your visa with, which is a difficult process in itself. So Labour and National have both created a really horrific immigration system. National has just made it worse. Just to give you an example, previously when Labour changed the scheme, they made it very easy for employers. They just had to connect with WINS for a little bit and then say, look, we tried to find jobs here without really proving that they did. But now the NAC10Z First Coalition has removed even that pretense and made it just a declaration. So they just have to tick a box and say we looked for jobs in this country. They removed the expectation for employers to give people with visas an opportunity to do online models about migrant exploitation during paid hours. They did this to ensure people knew their rights. They've taken that out. And that was just a small, tiny thing. It didn't even prevent exploitation, but whatever tiny things there were, they've taken it out. So they've made it even worse. And the Human Rights Commission hit them up about it as well. I want you to go next. Oh, well, on that one is an interesting one as well, actually, because it gives you an example of just how bad things were. So in this article, it tells us that, so Labour's changes, which created an opportunity for human trafficking, and that's not my words, that's the words of the Human Rights Commission. In one example, Barry's company, CPL Jobs, was actually deeply in debt to the IRD when he was granted 840 job tokens by Immigration New Zealand. So this guy, who was in debt to the IRD, was granted by the government an opportunity to bring 840 people in this country to work under them. So you can see how loose it is and how easy it is for people to pretty much order people in online, easier than it is to order packages from bloody Amazon. And so it was rife, and it is currently rife for exploitation. There's even, and you know, this is really on the nose, there's even a petition that someone has created pleading for the government to remove the language requirement for bus drivers, as previously they didn't need to do a language test because if they had worked for 2 years as a bus driver, that was seen as enough and they don't need to have any more language proficiency. They brought that test back. Labour brought that test back. Now there's a petition asking National to remove that, but they didn't. They've removed it from these wealthy people's visas. So it's not insulting for poor and workers who are migrants to come in the country and have to be treated like absolute shit, to have to be forced to share a room with 20 other people, to have to beg on the street for food, to have to experience slavery in New Zealand, but it's insulting for these guys. So just again, the mentality of our government. And with if you look at the Human Rights Commission, it's the next one. It's the next, yeah. So here you go. They call it coordinated people trafficking, and then at the end of that, they're like, we give the recommendation that you give these migrant visas their basic human rights. So they don't have they don't have the same human rights as everyone else in this country. And now we've got this new golden visa, which gives them even more special rights. And I just say this to point out that we very, very clearly have different rights in this country depending on who we are. And there's potentially no better example than the way that we treat our migrant workers, because they just don't even have the basic human rights that the rest of us do. And that's by design. That's by design from both parties. So we do live in a country that has different rights for different people, but it isn't Māori that are receiving the special rights. It's the wealthy.
It's a class issue. Oh, such a shame.
So Debbie Ngāwera Paka, she tried to bring this up in the House, and she put it to the Prime Minister, how will the golden visas improve ordinary New Zealanders' lives when there's no expectation that the profits earned will be invested back in the communities? He didn't really answer. And then again, she asks, what incentive do overseas investors have to look after our environment when they only have to stay here for 21 days over 3 years? And Luxon basically, again, doesn't reply. He just goes on this rant about how it's going to make some money. But then they send their attack dogs, Chris Bishop, and in this case, Winston Peters. And Bishop says, Māori Party needs to do economics 101 to know how this is good. Acting all clever and patronizing. And then Winston Peters also jumps in and says, and brings up the Waipōreira Trust, which, again, the Māori Party have themselves asked to be investigated on. So, they try and ask serious, proper questions in the House, and that's how they act. They just act like schoolyard bullies, and I've noticed that they do this especially to Māori women and women in general, and especially in the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. They feel what they want to do is they want to intimidate them. They want to scare them off from asking these questions because they themselves are feeling a certain way about it. So keep going, Māori Party. Keep asking them these really good questions. And this is, of course, with the backdrop that this government has been very clearly telling us they want to privatize our public assets. So most of you are very knowledgeable, but just to quickly explain, the idea of privatization is moving our assets like infrastructure or like buses, like our energy, from being in the ownership of the government, which means they can either run it at cost and keep our costs really low, or they can make profit but then reinvest that profit back in our communities. And we know how asset sales have gone for us in this country. It's gone horribly wrong in every single scenario, right? We take a look at our energy bills. That is a direct result of the fact that they've been privatized and they make so much money. They make millions and millions of dollars in profit. Well, that profit is coming directly from us overpaying for our power and our power bills. The buses are another really great example. Auckland almost has no locally owned bus company anymore. They're mostly owned by Australia and overseas bus companies. Again, they make massive profits. Who is this at the expense? It's at the expense of the workers, the bus drivers who are underpaid, and they're often protesting and asking for better pay and better rights. And it is at the expense of us because they're not they're trying to make as much profit as possible. So they're going to charge us as much as they think they can get away with. But government not only sees no issue with it, they actually use these examples to justify more privatization. Like, for example, we had Nicola Willicks telling RNZ, we will continue to own significant numbers of roads, hospitals, and schools, but the private sector has a role to play. And then she says, if you look to our energy markets, for example, there's widespread private ownership of some of our energy generation. So she's saying it like it's some kind of success, but we are struggling. You know, a lot of people in this country are going cold and their children are going cold because they can't afford to pay their power bills. So it just shows how detached they are from reality to use that as an example of success and why we should have further privatization. And it seems that privatizing the healthcare is going to be the way to go. This is a new article just from today. New Wellington Hospital shows private sector has key part in health. And that's potentially the scariest sector to privatize, because then if you can't afford healthcare like in America, then you just go without. If you don't have insurance and you can't afford it, then you go without. And same as everything else we've just said, the hospital's main or the health provider or the whoever is being contracted to support in the health industry, their main objective will be to make profit. That profit will come at our expense. They will raise costs because they know that those of us who can't afford it will just languish in the public system and go on extremely long wait lines. And they know that those who don't want to wait will just pay that extra cost. And so again, it's cementing the special rights that rich people have in this country when we do privatize public assets, because it gives them greater access to these things that should be human rights for everyone in the country. So everyone keep a close eye on that. They haven't made it a secret of it. They've been quite open. They're saying they're going to make it a election campaign for next time, but they've already started the process of privatizing things in small ways here and there. So keep an eye on that. And a major theme of the government at the moment is basically the exploitation of our environment, the destruction of our environment, and as we've already touched on, imaginary technological solutions to fix the mess that we are making in our environment. So they made this extremely clear. Luxon said in his this week in the House, we're going to get more farming, more fishing, more mining. And then you've got Bishop in the House. He says, bringing back a lot of old school colonial language, they were talking a lot about how we have so many abundant resources. Chris Bishop says we're a country blessed with abundant natural resources and plenty of land. Isn't it funny how they think we've got plenty of land but are unwilling to give Māori back more than 1% of the land that the Crown stole? So for them, justice out the window. If they think they can get $1 from an overseas investor, they'd rather do that than make sure their own people are flourishing and surviving on their own land. Again, Bishop tells the House, using our extraordinary, abundant plethora of natural resources that were endowed in New Zealand. And this is the narrative colonizers have always used. New Zealand, it's just abundant with resources. We have to go and extract. We have to go steal from her. And then he goes on to say, actually utilizing those natural resources means we can look after the ones we really want to protect, like our kia and kakapo and our kiwi. So, you know, classic greenwashing. They're saying, we're going to destroy the environment, but don't worry, we're going to create little sanctuaries where those animals can be safe, but only in those sanctuaries. We're going to destroy their natural habitat, and from the money that we make, we're going to make sure these animals don't go extinct. They're not going to be flourishing all over our ecosystem. They're just going to be existing so that they can say they haven't gone extinct. And this is the common thread throughout that you'll see that they're using in terms of justifying selling New Zealand, that We're going to sell New Zealand, but then we're going to make money with that. That's going to help us do great things.
Trickle down.
Yeah, basically. We've got Todd McClay. He's a farmer, and he said, right? I think Todd McClay's a farmer.
Todd McClay. I'd have to see him to know. Sounds like a farmer. Todd McClay.
He told the House, we've invested $400 million over the 4 years in emissions reductions technology that will increase production, not decrease. So they want to increase the farming in this country despite all of those horrible impacts that they have on our environment. But then they think it's fine because, as someone else from National called Ryan Hamilton says, technology that supports mastitis and foot disease for cattle is something that they're working on. So, you know, we're going to have more farming, but don't worry because we're going to have these emissions reductions technology and we're going to have this technology to stop the cows from suffering and getting all these infections from us putting too much pressure on them. And yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of examples here of all the things that they said about exploiting the environment. And one thing that stood out to me as well is, again, Shane Jones. He says the spoils of Mother Nature's bounty as we open up these massive vistas of utilization. And I don't know, I just feel really grossed out by the narrative of like opening up Mother Nature and exporting her and harvesting her spoils. Like for me, and this is quite an eco-feminist perspective, I guess, for me, it mirrors the really sexist, patriarchal aspects of our society. It mirrors the way that these aspects of domination against women and objectifying them and exploiting them and raping women, for me, it's mirrored in this attitude that these politicians have towards our environment, that they just want to open her up and get into her. And in a lot of ways, our disrespect for the environment, it affects, I believe anyway, our disrespect for the environment is at the heart of our disrespect for each other and our disrespect for women. And the way that they do not respect the sanctity of Papatuanuku, the way that they disrespect the sacredness of Mother Nature, for me is reflected in the way that they treat other people and the way they treat women.
Kilda. Yeah, beautiful.
So I just wanted to touch on that narrative that they just really want to get into the environment. And one of the things that they often use as a justification, this is like their favorite one, is that if we don't mine our own coal, we're going to have to bring in Indonesian coal. And Shane Jones repeated that in the House this time. So let's actually interrogate that narrative a little bit. Oh, yep. Kapa, you are on the right page.
I got it.
Sweet. So this argument that if we don't mine coal, we'd have to bring in Indonesian coal needs to die immediately because it is not based in reality. Forest and Bird tells us that over the past 30 years, New Zealand has exported more coal than it has imported by about 6 times. New Zealand has imported 6 times more coal than it has exported. So we don't need Indonesian coal. We just need to stop exporting our coal, keep it for New Zealand's use, and then that way we can work towards transitioning out of coal without importing coal into the country. And so again and again, he's using this argument, we have to mine it, otherwise we have to import it. No, what's happening at the moment is we're exporting it at a certain price, and then we're importing it at a different price. Maybe people are able to get it cheaper from Indonesia than from New Zealand companies. Totally twisted and upside down. Like, these should be state assets, if anything. Mine whatever necessary coal that we need until we figure our way out of this. But instead, he wants to open a massive market and to export coal and to export more than we keep in this country. Second point that should kill this argument about Indonesian coal is that last year, more money, and actually for the past few years, more money has been spent by the Crown treating the damages each year from one mine company spilling acid than it does in collecting royalties in coal. We spend more money cleaning after the spill of a mine company than we do actually making money from the coal companies in New Zealand. That's
Crazy.
outrageous. It costs us it costs us $2 million every year to clean up the acid from this mine spill, and we only make $1.5 million of crown royalties every year from mining coal. So it costs us more to have coal, and we export more coal than we import. In conclusion, it does not benefit us in any way, shape, or form to mine more coal for this country. And so Shane Jones and all of these jokers who are going out and saying to the opposition that they're irrational, that they need economics lessons, that they're stupid, all of these patronizing arguments, they need to educate themselves, or at least stop lying to the public, because I'm sure they know that this is a bullshit argument. So that's just one example of how selling New Zealand doesn't actually benefit us. But that's the argument that they're running with. And I want to get into what they say to justify selling our goods. And this is their main argument that they use, that Chris Luxon uses, which is that we don't get rich selling things to ourselves.
And so, the message very clearly back home to the people at home is that they understand that we are a trading nation. We don't get rich just selling stuff to each other in the South Pacific or within New Zealand. We actually need to send our great products and services out into the world, of which there's huge demand for, and make sure we open up new markets like the Middle East to actually get those products too. In doing that, we bring more money back at home, and that obviously is the way in which we can afford better public services like health and education. So, New Zealanders, I think, understand, yes, we want to be out there trading in the world. There's a huge opportunity for us, and there's huge demand for our products and services.
Pretty challenging.
So we don't get rich selling to ourselves. By the way, this is just yet another regurgitated narrative, because nothing about this coalition government is new or interesting. Look at this.
We won't get rich selling things to ourselves. Indeed, we need to sell more of our products and services to customers around the world.
All right. So this has been the ongoing narrative from the government, that we don't get rich selling to ourselves. It's a lie. I mean, it's a lie, because we actually get poorer when we do engage with foreign investment, when we do engage with exporting our products. And to go back to the example of farming, for me, it's outrageous that our farmers have to farm so much just to earn a living. For thousands of years, if you were the great human in the community who provided food for your community, that was your job. And that was enough to survive and thrive on. And that's what I believe should be enough for our farmers. But instead, all of these external pressures to export goods are now pushing them to the edge to farm so many products just to gain a living. When if they were just farming just for fellow New Zealanders, the amount that they need to farm is about 10% of what we farm now. They would have a lot more relaxed existence, and they deserve it. I think if you're feeding your village, that should be enough of a job. But these external pressures make it hard on our local workers, on our local businesses. And this idea, the main lie behind this idea, though, is that we are not currently rich, and that we need more money in order to build public infrastructure, in order to create community support, in order to give people benefits. That's the argument, right? That we need more external money in this country in order to have the basics. And Affandal actually said this. Sam Affandal, you remember that guy?
The bed leg guy.
Yeah. He actually said, we're not a wealthy country. When you look at who we want to compare ourselves to, we're falling behind. We need more capital coming to New Zealand. They're all saying this, right? But it's not true, because New Zealand is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We are currently the 7th richest country per capita in the world, and that's per wealth per person. So we have more wealth per person than the vast majority of the world. We're an extremely wealthy country. So what's the problem then? Why can we not get basic public services? Why can we not get roads and hospitals? Why do we have to fight just to have the most adequate of services? Well, the issue isn't that there's not enough wealth in this country, because obviously there is. The issue is the wealth distribution. And New Zealand's wealth distribution is absolutely shocking. So currently, half of our population owns 98% of wealth in this country. 98% of the wealth. Not just that, but even within that 98%, the majority of that half is still owned by a tiny percentage. So for example, the richest 5% in the country own 43% of the wealth in this country. And it goes up like that, like the top 1% have more than their fair share. So that's where all the wealth is. The issue isn't that we don't have enough wealth in this country. We have more than enough wealth in this country. We're one of the richest countries in the planet. The issue is that the wealth distribution is being divided unequally. And if we bring more wealth into this country, it's just going to divide up against the people exactly how that graph has got it. So that means, yes, some stuff will trickle down, but what we'll get is our tiny, 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 tiny share if we're in that bottom 50%. We're going to get 2% of whatever wealth this country comes, and we have to divide it between 50% of the population. So that's the problem. And so they're constantly saying we need more wealth, but no one interrogates them on that. None of our journalists interrogate them on that. Because it's a lie. It's a lie that we are a very wealthy country. We do have a lot of wealth in the country. It's just that we've got extremely, really, really wealthy people hoarding all that money. And so what's the solution? The solution is proper taxes, for example. It's to stop all the policies that enable people to accumulate so much wealth in the first place. It's capital gain taxes. It's changing the way that we run this whole country. It's not allowing monopolies to come into towns like our town in Kaikohe. Back in the day when the warehouse came here, when when Countdown a New World, when these giant companies came here, it destroyed the local economy. Because you can imagine all these small different shops, one offering shoes, one offering clothes, one offering this. They're all going under when the warehouse comes into your backyard, because that offers all of those things for less. So we have to change the way that we run this country if we want more.
Got to change the world.
We got to change the whole world, but we can definitely just start with something like capital gains and wealth taxes. So that's something that we can push for. And Hannah Rafferty Maipi Clark actually did a great job in the House of calling this out. She called out the way that our wealth is unevenly distributed. But yeah, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more from our journalists. I'd like to see more from other politicians calling out the lie for what it is. We're an extremely wealthy country. And, you know, they say we need more wealth before we can have our basics. How wealthy do we have to be? Do we have to be number one? Do we have to be the wealthiest country on the planet just to have hospitals? You know?
Yeah, and something that I have always thought is like really perverse about Luxon's narrative, right? He's like, we need to be the best country in the world. In the world. And it's like, for me, you know, it's like, we should be as good as we need to be to get our basics. Anything beyond that, you're taking away from someone else. You know? He's talking about extracting wealth from countries that are worse off than us. You know? For our own luxuries. But, you know, this is a bigger conversation than just Aotearoa. You know, we're talking about capitalism. You know, we live in a capitalist world. You know, it's like a conversation that came up at Waitangi. You know, that you can't capitalism your way out of colonialism. But, you know, we have to work with what we've got to a degree to make this new world. But the conversation needs to shift. We're still on this trajectory of just slash and burn, and just sell everything. Like you say, yeah, I really support Te Pāti Māori and all of these other groups who are talking about changing this system. I mean, it's insane that, you know, we're like on the other side of the world for a lot of the people, a lot of the countries that buy our products. The emissions of just having to transport it is an insane thing. We are so fortunate here in Aotearoa to have the climate that we do, to have everything that we do. You know, we could be a completely self-sufficient country. And I think being a self-sufficient country with a closed loop is something that we need to talk about more. Not enough people talk about this. We're always talking about, you know, how to sell our products, how to get out into the world, but I think we need to start changing that conversation. Start looking at a circular economy. And, you know, technology, the tech sector is the fastest growing sector in Aotearoa. So, you know, we're very smart. We have a lot of innovation here in Aotearoa. You know, and not just GE, but all sorts of technology. We're very good at that in terms of exporting our smarts to the world. And we make a lot of money off of that. And it's far more sustainable than exporting an actual physical good. You know, and just like the dairy stuff is insane, milk powder is the main thing that we sell. And, you know, water is so precious and essential to create that milk. But then we dry the water out of the milk so that we can then send it over to another country who then rehydrates the milk with their water. You know, and so it's just all of these insane inefficiencies. And even though the dairy industry says that we are the most efficient producers of dairy in the world, which we found out that they're not even on paper. Apparently Australia, Fonterra found out that Australia now, we'll have to pull up that statistic just to make sure, but I remember you telling me about it yesterday, that now even Australia...
They're admitting it.
Yeah.
We already knew, but now they're admitting that, yeah, Australia is actually more efficient in their dairy than New Zealand.
And, you know, I'm not a huge fan of tourism, but if we were to weigh things up in terms of what is worse, you know, if we were to move to an economy where we are exporting technology, changing our export technology, and then be able to look after our natural landscapes, be able to maintain our unique story, you know, actually become clean and green, because we're not. But so export technology, which has a lower environmental footprint, look after our story, and then bring in tourists. And tourism was at one point bringing in more money than the dairy industry. And it's capable of getting back there again. Again, I'm not a huge fan of tourism, and we would have to scale it back, I think, to be sustainable. But I think that's the kind of pathway that we should be looking after. Exporting something that doesn't environmentally hurt us and maintain our clean green image so that we can, if we want to, still export value add products. Like, you know, I don't eat cheese, but some type of specialty cheese that is only from a particular part of this country that has a story attached to it, that value add story.
And many farmers wanted to go down that track. Like, I remember these conversations over the past few years, and farmers kept telling us, well, no, because we're going to create these, you know, special high value dairy products that are made from, you know, grass fed, organic, But now that narrative seems to have completely dropped, especially from the government. They're talking about more. They're talking about more farming. I think they're giving up on that high value product thing, and they're just going to go for quantity and just find new markets to sell that to.
Yep. It's sad. It's the wrong direction. Farming leadership groups, they really need to be the ones leading this. And I think they're leading their farmers in the wrong direction. You know, all of the farms here in Aotearoa are eventually going to be all automated. And essentially we're going to be creating like lab-based milk, but with real cows. And then if you look at like where people are at in terms of lab-based milk, which doesn't involve a cow, like through what's called precision fermentation, they are going to be able to create things like milk powder, our main export, and the cost parity, it's already very close. And so, you know, a company like Nestle, they're not going to care about where that milk powder comes from. When we sell our milk powder to Nestle and it ends up in like candy bars and stuff like that, it's completely devoid from that kind of origin story that we like to try and sell our products with. It's completely devoid of that. And so, you know, we're going down this super artificial, mechanized, automated system when actually it's more efficient, more sustainable, smarter, more effective. You make more money by doing it without the cow. And the technological route that we're currently going down, we may as well do it without the cow. We're roboticizing the cows and their processes so much that these cows may as well be machines.
Yeah, exactly. And, they talk about growth a lot, right? We need growth. And, that like defining what growth means. And I think we need a better word than degrowth, for example, for the other side. Like that I heard them attack the opposition by saying, oh, those guys are into degrowth. But I think, it's a matter of semantics, I know. But I would argue that we want more growth. We want more growth of small businesses. We want more growth of farmers selling locally to their neighbors.
Get rid of the middleman. Get rid of the middleman.
Exactly. That would actually generate a lot more growth in the community. So it's about how you look at growth. Like they just want to grow monopolies and they want to grow the wealth of a small few. But we're saying we want to grow the capability of everyone in our community to provide for themselves without having to rely so much on external inputs and imports all the time. And, with like we're seeing what Trump is doing, it's volatile because he might just one day wake up, oh, I'm going to put tariffs on this. I'm going to put tariffs on that. Or, like what happened in Ukraine and that impacted us. So it does make us more vulnerable. But if we had more self-sufficiency as a country, we would be able to be a lot wealthier for it. And I mean wealthy in the sense that everyone is flourishing, not that a select few have a lot of wealth that they're hoarding for themselves.
Kia ora. Very good, very good. All right, we're not finished.
Oh, yeah.
We better crack on because it's getting late.
All right, yeah, we might have to not finish everything, but we'll keep going for a little bit longer.
Kapai.
I think the school lunch thing is a great example of this selling New Zealand thing that this government is going with. So we've seen a lot in the news recently about these school lunches and how terrible they are. But I think the real story with school lunches is the fact that they've moved these contracts, these government-funded contracts, from being for local family-owned businesses that were producing healthy food for their own communities, and instead put it in the hands of this giant multinational, extremely dodgy company called Compass. So they gave them an $85 million annual contract for the school lunch collective, they call them. And it's led by this Compass group, right? These guys, Compass group, they are notoriously bad. Like, it's honestly hilarious. It's like they looked for the worst lunch provider in the planet and then hired those. They've even had issues in New Zealand where they've had a contract to provide food for hospitals and then it had to get cancelled because of how bad it is. So there's even history in New Zealand, but let's just look at some of their scandals, this Compass group, that the government decided to award an $85 million contract to provide food for our kids. It's such a long list of scandals. I'll just touch on a few of them. In 2006, Compass settled up to $40 million out of court after it was accused of attempting to bribe a UN official to award the company catering contracts worth in excess of $350 million. Okay, so they're in the business of bribing to get contracts. Just putting that out there. In 2002, their subsidiary was forced to pay $18 million to New York State, as well as $19 million to Washington, D.C., for financial mismanagement and late, spoiled, and poor quality school catering. In 2021, that same company, the subsidiary of Compass, was embroiled in an infamous school meal scandal in the UK, where it was revealed that it cashed in while providing meager substandard food boxes to school children. Does that ring any bells? Another scandal. Unite, one of the biggest trade unions in the UK, said that this company, subsidiary of Compass, was Britain's most heartless employer in a dispute where they outsourced cleaners and catering staff at the Ministry of Defence faced false redundancy in a fire and rehire maneuver. So they're awful to their workers. And there's more scandals, and a lot of them relate specifically to school meals and the way they, for example, sometimes they were providing school meals that turned out to be more expensive than if people had just straight up went and bought them in order to make profit. In one particularly dodgy case, they actually got found for putting horse meat in their school lunches. And a whole bunch of kids accidentally ate horse meat. So this is the company that our government had decided to contract to provide lunches for our school children. And it really is worrying. They're sneaking in all sorts of stuff in the slop, like horse meat. And they're notorious, having lost numerous cases and paid out tens and tens of millions of dollars for providing substandard school lunches, for mistreating their workers, for overcharging for really terrible meals. And these are the guys that our government decided to give money to. And I just think this is a perfect example of the direction of this government. They want to take money, our taxpayer money, and instead of putting it back in our communities, like previously, it was going to locally owned family, local businesses that provided lunch for schools. It's taken it out from our own people and given it to this private company. And that's what they want to do. Every business that they want to move from being provided by a local to a multinational or to any private corporation is another example of that, of money that's our own taxpayer money being directly going into shareholder profits. When instead, we should be cutting out the middleman. It should be just a government provided program, in my opinion. They should be providing the food at cost, no profit.
Yeah, I mean, it should be like local farmers, right? Local farmers should be producing this. We should be creating jobs for our local food producers to produce food for locals. Common sense.
Yeah, so all of that narrative that they came out with before the election, that they're for localism and they're for devolution, they're actually, of course, were completely lying and projecting. What they're doing is the opposite. They're removing the control from the locals and they're putting it into centralized big companies like this Compass Group. So that's,
oh boy,
that's not growth. That's not growth. Growth would have been incentivizing numerous local businesses to provide these school lunches and to get these government contracts, right?
I mean, David Seymour just hates the program. He said it himself. We should have made this one of the slides, right? He didn't want to keep the program.
Right.
He didn't want to keep it. And so he said, and it's quotable, he literally was just like, fine, well, we're going to make it cheaper then. So what is he doing? He wants to ruin the program. It's the same as what they're doing with everything else, with public services and whatnot. They want to defund them. They want to make them shit so that people start getting frustrated, so that they open their minds to the only solution that they're going to offer up, which is to privatize these services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when Chloe Swarbrick brought that up to them earlier on, they called her a conspiracy theorist. She said, no, are you deliberately defunding these programs so that you can privatize them? And they said, oh, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist.
That's their thing. It's like when Mihi Ngārangi pulled up David and he's like, she was like, do you have a connection with the Atlas Network? And he's just like, oh, I've heard this crazy conspiracy theory before. So, it's just the thing that they do. They're like, oh, you're woke, conspiracy theory, Māori Communists, you know what? It's just like
it's a gaslighting. It's a gaslighting thing, right? You're crazy if you don't think exactly in the way that you do, in the way that they want you to think. So that's the school lunch program. It's concerning because it's like, for me, it's an extension of what I was saying before about the disrespect for Papatūānuku. Children are along that same spectrum. The people that are vulnerable in our society, and you wish to inflict suffering on them, that's a part of that domination mindset where you have to dominate everyone that you deem below you. So this attack on children is part of that. And it's not just the school lunches, it's the boot camps, it's the ram raid thing that going after them, it's the, using the gang patch legislation to terrorize little kids that might be wearing something looking like a gang patch. It is an attack on kids, and it is a privileging of these private corporations. And just quickly, don't know if you've got it open. Yeah. So they come out with this contract. They say it's going to cost us $3 a meal or whatever. But unsurprisingly, and this always happens when the government pays private companies to do it, they later on come out and say, oh, actually, we can't provide it at that price. So they've gone and added an extra $8.9 million to their deal so that they can provide slightly bigger meals for certain children. So, you know, again, Labour and National both do this. They'll contract out to private companies, and the private companies will increase their costs as they're doing it. And in order to get it completed, you have to agree. So that's another risk of these private corporations. And that's the Compass thing. The next story I'll just touch on super quickly.
Cook Islands.
That's not it.
Oh, were we ready for Cook Islands? No.
I was going to talk about Golras, but I can. It's all right. I'll just say just really quickly. Yet another article about Golras came out. This time her image was leaked from the security camera, and the police deny leaking it. The security firm deny leaking it, and the supermarket deny leaking it, and the police say they're not going to do anything about it. But basically what we're seeing is an intense targeted harassment campaign against an individual in this country, and it should terrify all of us. It's quite chilling, because what they're doing is they're using security footage, and God knows how many cameras are around us, right? This is only going to increase in time as we enter this, or as the surveillance age exasperates. We're going to find ourselves that there are cameras everywhere, and when they want to come after us, they're going to use those against us, and they're going to do targeted harassment campaigns, and they're going to use all of their alternative media and mainstream media, and they're going to use the police, and they're going to use all of the tools in the toolbox and rely heavily on surveillance to destroy the characters of certain individuals.
Hiding Tim Jago under Golras. Oh, man.
But it is, I mean, yeah, thinking about the coverage of Jago and thinking about the way that they have just like avoid touching that story. But when it comes to Golras, even though it's clearly a targeted harassment campaign at this stage, they're still writing stories about it. But yeah, it's just something to keep an eye on. Like, we don't go to the supermarket in our town that has cameras in it. We don't support that, because it is just going to open it up for opportunities like this, where even when you haven't done anything wrong, because in her case, she just put things in a tote bag. She didn't leave the supermarket.
We all do that. I always put things straight in my bag. It's crazy.
But if they want to build a narrative around something, they will do it.
Mm-hmm. And she had a shopping trolley, right? She had a shopping trolley. It's like, you know, she was... There's nothing to suggest that she was going to steal it. Anyway, it's a crazy story.
It is a crazy story. But yeah, so there you go. The police will use surveillance tools in the country, as well as their outrageous right-wing media pundits and the mainstream media, to create targeted campaigns against individual citizens in the country.
Kapai.
And that's it for local news, everyone. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some international news. I'll try and go quickly because we've been here a while. Hopefully try and finish by 8:30.
Sounds good.
Kapai. So, in the news, you've probably seen this little tiff that we're having with the Cook Islands. And basically, the Cook Islands, they're having a meeting with China. It's happening really soon to decide on some agreement between them. And New Zealand said you didn't consult us enough, according to our agreement in 2001, which requires consultation on foreign affairs matters. Now, Cook Islands said, well, it has nothing to do with foreign affairs. This is just an economic agreement. And besides, you enter into economic agreements like this all the time. In fact, you've entered into a very similar agreement with China that we're about to enter into, and we didn't expect you to consult with us. So from the Cook Islands perspective, they're saying we think this relationship is reciprocal. Mm-hmm. But New Zealand is coming back, and they're showing their true colonizer colors. They do not view the Cook Islands as reciprocal. They still, in many ways, view them as a colony. So this isn't new. Just to trace back the history of our relationship with the Cook Islands, in 1901, the Cook Islands becomes a colony of New Zealand. All right. So the Cook Islands were colonized, and they said it was part of the realm of New Zealand. Now, it wasn't until 1965 when the United Nations was undergoing decolonization reforms, that the United Nations actually put pressure on New Zealand to give the Cook Islands more independence. New Zealand didn't want to give them their full independence, though, so they came up with this thing called a free association. And they said the Cook Islands can enter into a free association with us, they can maintain their citizenship, but they can be a mostly autonomous government, but it required, like I said, consultation on some things. So we enter into this joint agreement, but our mentality around the Cook Islands remains that of them being a colony. In 2001, that same year, Helen Clark felt the need to make it really clear that they cannot join the UN as a member state, and that if they do, they would have to lose their New Zealand citizenship. So that was in 2001, but then again in 2015, as you can see, John Key repeats that same demand, that you cannot join the UN membership without losing your New Zealand status, right? So we've already been limiting them from exercising greater determination for all these years. They were trying to be a member of the Commonwealth. They were trying to be a member state of the United Nations, and New Zealand is getting in the way. So fast forward to today, and they are acting so belligerent towards the Cook Islands. Many Cook Islanders I've seen in comments call it bullying, that New Zealand is bullying them. And I do feel like that's what we're doing. For example, Mark Brown, the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, said he was interested in looking at the idea of dual citizenship, right? They're trying to be independent. They've been dreaming of this, forever. Every country wants to be independent. So they want to have their own passport. And he said that New Zealand, quote unquote, reared their teeth.
Okay.
So we bullied them into dropping that whole passport, having their own independent passport, because we said we'll lose it. And we've seen this really interesting thing of so many of our journalists and pundits pushing this extreme anti-China view and pushing the Prime Minister and Winston Peters to act even a stronger way in response to the Cook Islands. This one probably needs to get the top mention, but Matthew Houghton wrote this absolutely ridiculous article. Should New Zealand invade the Cook Islands?
Outrageous.
It's so outrageous, and it mirrors what we see from the warmongers in America. Anytime anything happens, then they're like, should we invade Iran? Should we invade Iraq? These war lobbyists, and he appears to be one of them, pushing for, I don't think necessarily he's pushing for us to invade them, but he wants to intimidate the Cook Islands into subservience using these narratives. And this was rightly called out by this article in the Asia Pacific report. They had a few words to say about Matthew Houghton. And they said, they talked about how dangerous what he's saying is. And they said that, this could be written off as the hyperventilating screeching of someone trying to drum up readers, but he was given a major platform to do so, and New Zealanders live in an oxygen-starved media environment where alternative analysis is hard to find.
Yeah.
And that's very true. These people shouldn't have been published on the Herald like that. If he had just put his reckons on a tweet, that's one thing, but the fact that we have an article saying that is shameful, and I honestly feel the need to apologize on behalf of our government to the Cook Islands people, because this is really arrogant, really colonial attitude that we're having towards them is unacceptable. Look at this next one from a honorary captain in the Royal New Zealand Navy, Stephen Hoadley. He says, what would happen to the 20 or 30,000 Cook Islanders who live in Auckland and surrounding areas? Would they suddenly become aliens? And would we have to do a Donald Trump and consider deportation? I certainly hope not. Sounds like he's making a threat, doesn't it? To me, that sounds like a threat. That sounds like more intimidation tactics. So that's what our journalists are doing. I also saw them in a press conference with Luxon, and one after one, what are you going to do about Mark Brown? Ooh, Mark Brown, has he gone rogue? You know, in China this, China that. Well, listen, Mark Brown pointed this out beautifully. China is New Zealand's #1 trading partner. We have a very similar agreement with China to the one that the Cook Islands wants to have with them. So we think we have the right to form these agreements and enter these deals with China, but we want to control what the Pacific Islands does. And of course, the context for that is that the United States has brought us into their aims in the Pacific Islands. Like, for example, we've joined this sub-NATO committee called the IP4 with a few other countries in the area to try and counter Chinese influence in the Pacific. But what does the Pacific want? Because they can make the decisions for themselves, and they are a self-determining people. So, for example, this deep sea mining was raised as an issue. That's something for the Cook Islanders to deal with, just like we have all of our hideous environmental issues to deal with here. And absolutely, many Cook Islanders have said, we want more transparency around these agreements, and I agree with them, but that doesn't give New Zealand the right to interfere in their affairs.
Killed it.
And
you know, one thing that, you know, maybe something we should start doing, you know, the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands, talking about Captain Cook. You know, what a day to be talking about this. The day that in Hawaii, Captain Cook was killed and eaten by our homies in Hawaii. So just a short little mihi to all of our Hawaiian whanaunga and to our Rarotongan whanaunga. Yeah, this is their quest for their mana motuhake. And so we don't have any right to be behaving in this way. And I think maybe you're going to touch on it, but the way that we've seen it portrayed in the media, there'll be like a Chinese flag that's, you know, the most visible thing. And it's hooked into the narrative that we need to be afraid of China. But, you know, China is doing all sorts of things that we should be currently doing. We have been dropping our responsibilities. Like
like Mark Brown actually said it in one of the interviews. He explicitly said, of course, we respect and are thankful to our traditional partners like New Zealand and Australia. But what happens when you go and ask your traditional partners for help in X and Y and Z and they say no? Are we supposed to just sit at home and do nothing? No, we're going to go and seek help elsewhere, and that's completely fair enough. We cannot expect the Cook Islands to be reliant on us and then not provide them what they need, but at the same time not allow them, as if we have the right, to go and engage with other countries. And you look at this next one, it's not the only time that we've done this. We also recently got annoyed at Kiribati because they cancelled a meeting with Winston Peters, and he says, we're going to review your funding. Like, that's such bully tactics. You didn't meet with me, so I'm not going to give you this fundamentally important funding that you need for your survival. And it mirrors the way that Shane Jones threatened the Waitangi Trust to cut funding because he didn't like how he was treated, right? So they act like bullies, and the Pacific Islands are getting sick of it. Kiribati, Niue, who, by the way, is another one of those prior colonies of New Zealand and is now in a free association agreement with New Zealand. They are creating relationships with other countries, which they are explicitly allowed to do in our association agreement. And they're doing so out of necessity. Like the Cook Islands talked about diversifying from tourism. They don't just want to be a tourist country for wealthy people to come into while remaining in poverty forever, you know? Mark Brown pointed out, for example, that the Cook Islands diaspora and Cook Island companies actually provide the New Zealand economy with over $1 billion a year. But wow. New Zealand only provides Cook Islands with $60 million over 3 years. So he says the question is who is paying who in this relationship. Exactly. We are in an exploitative relationship with the Pacific Islands. New Zealand is a colonizing force. We need to understand that, and we need to begin to decolonize our relationship with these nations. If you look as well, like this is a really old, this is an old tactic of ours. This is back in 2018. Again, we're annoyed that Niue is talking to the Chinese about trade. So this is a common theme with the New Zealand government trying to control what the Pacific Islands do. We want them to be dependent on us, and we don't want them to build relationships with China because we are in an anti-China pact with the United States. But look at how China treats the Pacific Islands. This is extremely telling. So you remember how New Zealand sunk a ship off the coast of Samoa, the Manawanui?
Mm-hmm.
Samoa communities affected by the Manawanui sinking seek support from China.
Mm-hmm.
The actual grassroots community in that town, not the Samoan government, the actual community who's been impacted by New Zealand's blunder is asking support from the Chinese government to help them survive because we've prevented them from being able to fish in their area and to provide for their community. They used to sell that fish to other villages, and that's how they used to make their money. They haven't been able to do that. New Zealand didn't provide the help. Their own government didn't provide the help. They're going to China for support. So for me, this is extremely illustrative of the different relationship that we have with the island countries and that China has with the Pacific Islands. Like China is offering to fix our mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
China is offering to do infrastructure and trade and developments, whatever you think of them, whether they're harmful for the environment or not. It's a consensual agreement that the Cook Islands and other countries are entering into with China. But we don't do by consent. We use power. We use bullying. We use threatening. We use the threat of cutting your aid. So first we make them dependent on us by making them a colony, right? Then we maintain their dependence through the free association, which, again, it's not like the Cook Islands had much choice at that stage. And now we want to use their reliance on us against them to try and get them to do our bidding. And I think that's disgusting colonial attitude.
Not only that, but, China has been one of our, if not one of our biggest trading partners.
Yeah.
So, all of that dairy, the primary partner that we export to is China. And it's just the way that our media has demonized China in many ways. We're kind of throwing it all back in their face. Economically, it had always seemed that we were more aligned with China. But despite all of that and how they've, propped us up economically, we just see our old alliances, our old colonial alliances taking that is paramount. And it just seems so disrespectful.
It's interesting because we've it just again highlights how the government's actions are not in the interests of New Zealanders. They're not in the interests of even farmers who trade with China. Their interests lie with power. And power, well, it comes from the United States first and foremost. So they are willing to put their allegiance to that power up and above above our own New Zealand interests. For example, in our relationship with China, because they're threatening that relationship of trade with China by being such dicks, but they don't really care. So we will be definitely talking about the islands more. I am definitely educating myself on the topic at the moment. I want to regularly talk about it because we
are essentially the colonial power
in the Pacific.
In the Pacific. Five Eyes and other various spy agencies that we have, we are spying on our Pacific neighbors and then selling that data to our colonial allies. And there's all of this fear-mongering around China. Who is the country that has nuclear-armed submarines all over the world? There's only one country. The one country that has the power to essentially destroy any of us whenever they want to. It's only one country, and it's the United States.
China has one external military base. I think the US has over 800. So yeah, it's clear that one is a military power that's threatening the world, and the other is an economic player, and they make agreements with consent.
Two very different styles. I mean, we're not under any illusion. You know, China is such a giant country. There are so many crimes and awful things that we do here in Aotearoa that our simple, silly little government does here. I have no doubt there is all sorts of levels of corruption and awful things that exist in China. But I think for a lot of our people here locally, we need to remember that we are seeing China through a particular lens. The way that the media talks about China, the way that our political leaders talk about China, it's through their perspective, you know? And instead, the way that we view America, you know, we've had Hollywood, you know? All of their war stories are seen as like hero stories. And we, you know, they've built a positive association for us with the USA and America, but they've consistently demonized China. And, you know, so we're not under any illusion. We know that they're big. We know that they've got their issues. But what we're asking is for people to be critical in terms of where they receive their information about China. Are you receiving it from a biased source? What type of perspective is being layered over that? Because, you know, you cannot rely on the media. You cannot rely on our journalists. This is the information that we all need to go out and find for ourselves. We need to expose ourselves more to Chinese culture. And you know, we have a lot of Chinese people here, a lot of Chinese communities here in Aotearoa. And an interesting thing we looked into is that the Chinese demographics here in Aotearoa largely lean towards voting national. But the powers, I would say, who back national are the same powers that are spreading this kind of anti-China propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it comes from Labour as well, the anti-China propaganda.
But our corporations, our main powerful industries, those who create the narratives that exist in our country, and for me, that represents a big demographic that we should be connecting more with, so that we can, you know, I don't think voting national is the way to go. So I think this is a demographic that we need to learn more about and that we need to have more empathy towards. I think most of us kind of shut off when it comes to Chinese culture.
It's like an accepted type of racism. And I've seen it with my own eyes. New Zealanders often make anti-China comments and they think it's acceptable. You know, like they'll do like ching ching chong with their eyes and stuff like that. And it's just for some reason normalized in this country. And the media is not helping. They're putting out narratives like China wants to take over the Pacific. This is just a myth. This is just a story. There's only one empire, and it's led by the United States.
Killed it.
So speaking of which, our final topic, which I'm going to try and whiz through super quickly, is
You've
Palestine.
got 2 minutes. 2 minutes for Palestine. Oh, aroha.
Oh, okay. We
might have to extend it a little bit.
Kapai, but with just a quick update with what's happening in Palestine. Firstly, as we've known for a long time now, but is now confirmed, Israel used the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. What's the Hannibal Directive? It's when they shoot their own people to prevent them from being taken hostages. At the time, it was blatantly obvious that they'd done that because of the damage that was caused. You saw images of October 7th and there was all these cars that were burnt, turned to rubble. Al-Qassam brigades didn't have weaponry that could cause that. It's just blatantly obvious that they used massive machine power, that they used helicopters, that they inflicted a lot of the damage on October 7th themselves. And now they're admitting it for the first time. So all the people who was called conspiracy theorists, who were denounced and got in trouble for saying that they killed their own people on October the 7th, they're not going to say anything about this, unfortunately, you know, and nothing in the media about this. But Yoav Gallant admits in this video that they used the Hannibal Directive on the day. Not only that, but at the end of the video, he says, you know, and unfortunately, we didn't do it more. So they killed their own people because they didn't want them taken hostages. Why did they not want them taken hostages? Because they didn't want to exchange Palestinian hostages for Israeli hostages. Because in the past, Palestinians have taken one person hostage, for example, and been able to exchange them for around 100 Palestinian hostages. And when you know how awful the treatment of Palestinian hostages are in Israeli dungeons, you understand why they're desperate to get them out. So they didn't want to, so they'd rather kill their own people, and that's exactly what happened. Nothing in our news about that. Kapai. Let's talk about the ceasefire deal. So, with the ceasefire deal that we've had, of course, Israel hasn't lived up to it. There's been hundreds of violations. This has been broadcasted day in and day out. Finally, Al-Qassam brigades decided to tell Israel, if you don't stop violating the ceasefire, if you don't stop murdering, bombing our people, if you don't allow the things that you have said that you were going to allow, such as pop-up homes and more tents for people, we're not going to stick with our end of the bargain. And just to clarify again, this is after hundreds of ceasefire violations. This is after Israel had murdered 112 people at that stage from the ceasefire, 118 people. Israel had murdered 118 people. Israel was preventing basic necessities from getting in, and Al-Qassam brigades didn't breach the agreement despite all of that. They were sticking with their side of the bargain until finally they say, hey, if you don't stick by your side of the bargain, we're not going to release the next 3 hostages. And of course, our media acts like they're not sure what the truth is. Who knows? Hamas says this, Israel says that. They always do that, right? One side said this, one side says that, even though their job as journalists is to try and tell us what the objective reality is. And there was an objective reality in this case. We were seeing it with our own eyes. But not only that, Israel actually admitted it themselves in their newspaper. They admit, if you click on that one, yeah. So the defense establishment and the IDF say that so far the terrorist organization has not violated the agreement, and therefore it is very doubtful whether Israel could take steps against Hamas at this stage. Okay, so this is Israel admitting that Hamas has not breached the ceasefire deal at that point. Okay, so there we have an objective fact. And then we also, on top of that, have Israel saying, oh, but we did. Right there, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive matter, 3 Israeli officials and 2 mediators said that Hamas's claims were accurate in terms of Israel failing to uphold their promises in the first phase of the ceasefire. So Israel admits that Hamas didn't violate the ceasefire, and Israel admits that they themselves have violated the ceasefire by not allowing things in. And by the way, just, you know, extra context, Palestinians are living in rubble. They have nothing. It's been, you know, a genocide that has occurred on their land, and there's just rubble and dead bodies. It's just a mass grave. So they need at least a tent over their heads, and Israel's trying to prevent that from happening, right? And just in case we needed more proof that this is indeed what happens, this is from the discussion with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians explicitly saying here that as long as Israel implements the next phase of the deal, that they should be able to complete the next phase of the ceasefire deal. It says right there, the report added that if Israel approves entry of the caravans by Thursday, it could pave the way for the completion of the next ceasefire deal. So clearly, the ceasefire deal is being held up by Israel. But our media just acts like, who knows? Who knows? Israel says this, Hamas says this, who knows, right? And of course, you know, all the people that are being killed day in and day out, they're erased from the story. All the terror that Israel is inflicting is erased from the story. But worse than that, recently our media made a really big deal about the 3 Israeli hostages that were released that looked like they had been hungry. They looked a lot skinnier than when they were taken, all right? And it's just crazy because they didn't even give the context that Israel had been starving the population in Gaza. I mean, they explicitly came out on day one and said there'll be no food, no water, nothing. They're going to live like animals. What did you expect would happen to their hostages? This is just blatantly obvious context that any reporter should add. This wasn't in the news. And day out, they had this image of the 3 hostages and trying to paint Hamas as the savages in the story, right?
And they've been so honorable. You know, they've been so honorable. This is the first time that I feel like I have seen something where the media can really pin anything on them. You know, everything else has been like flawless, professional, ethical, beautiful, like inspiring, like really interesting and amazing. And it's been hard to paint Hamas in a negative light. But with this instant, they've just jumped on it. And like you said, taken out the context that they've been starving people. So that's ridiculous.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's crazy when you compare the way that Israel treats Palestinian hostages and the way that Al-Qassam treats Palestinian hostages, and yet the media only focuses on Al-Qassam's hostages. It's just like, it's just this, it's painful to be honest, because it's this constant reaffirmation for us that Palestinian lives do not matter. None of the Palestinians before October the 7th mattered. Because if they do, then they'd be telling us about those hostages, those Palestinian hostages. Even better, they'd be telling us about the fact that everyone in Palestine is a hostage. You see this inversion of reality, them focusing on Al-Qassam's 3 Israeli hostages, is hiding the bigger picture that everyone in Palestine is a hostage in the most horrific apartheid regime that has ever existed, under the most horrific occupation that systematically not only tortures and abducts, but systematically murders people, systematically mass murders people. All of this is erased and the story starts on October 7th. And then the story ends. So not only does none of that matter, but nothing after October 7th matters. Like, it's just crazy that they're highlighting those 3 Israelis who are still alive, but at the same time, people are finding their heads of their sons under the rubble. People are finding arms. People are saying they can't breathe because it's a massive graveyard and the stench of death. Like, it's crazy to me that they would focus on that aspect of it when the reality of the mass suffering is just, it cannot even compare what Palestinians are being put through and have been put through. And
they were waiting for it. They're just these reporters and whatnot. They're just there waiting patiently for anything that they can pull up to support their narrative that it's the Palestinians who are the evil ones.
Absolutely. Oh, and just to wrap up the ceasefire kōrero. So basically what's happening now, we're waiting until Saturday, but all things considered, it looks like Israel's going to back down, thankfully. So despite them coming out really strongly and saying, if you don't release the hostages, we're going to da-da-da-da-da-da-da, quietly, trucks have started entering into Gaza. And supplies and tents have been coming in. So it looks like Hamas called their bluff and Israel, hopefully, is going to...
Inshallah.
Allow things in, and hopefully the ceasefire deal will continue, and hopefully the hostages will come out on Saturday. We're going to be keeping a close eye on it, but it looks like Israel's giving in because you know, they tried to have their cake and eat it too. Which, by the way, Israel has done this across every single ceasefire that they've ever reached an agreement with. They will abide by it, or you know, abide to an extent, until they get what they want. Usually in the first phase is getting their hostages back. And then afterwards, they just resume the killing. They've done this every single time. So we have precedent for this. That's another thing that annoys me about the news. It's not just their word against this other people's word. We have context. We have every single other ceasefire deal that Israel has broken and resumed mass murder afterwards. Kapai, so that's that. And then I just wanted to quickly give you some examples of how horrifically, that video there, I was going to just talk about, like there's literally videos of Israelis destroying food from entering into Gaza while they're having hostages there. Like, what did they think was going to happen? It's just ridiculous. But well, this is what I wanted to talk about just really quickly. We touched on this already, but Palestinian hostages are being mass tortured inside Israeli prisons. One really famous one is the director of the hospital who was famously abducted. Yep, this one. And if we just play this video really quickly from the beginning.
A prominent Gaza hospital director is being subjected to various forms of torture and inhumane treatment in an Israeli prison. That's according to a lawyer who's visited Dr. Hussam Abu Safia in Offa prison in the occupied West Bank for the first time. Israeli forces detained Abu Safia during a raid on Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza in December. His lawyer says the doctor has spent 47 days in arbitrary detention. He was refused access to legal counsel and to a doctor. The statement released by Dr. Safia's lawyer reads, at the beginning of his arrest and during his transfer from the Gaza Strip, he was forced to take off his clothes, his hands were tied. He was beaten with an electric stick and hit on the chest. He also stayed in the cells for 25 days in Offa prison, including 10 days during which he was subjected to almost continuous interrogation, and he fainted in the cell due to a feeling of suffocation. A prominent Gaza...
So, on Stuff News one night, after they talked about the Israeli hostages, they did quickly talk about Palestinian, they call them prisoners, never ever ever calling them hostages. That's funny in itself, right? Israelis are hostages, but Palestinians are only ever prisoners, which implies that they've done something wrong, even though they're under an apartheid occupation that mass abducts Palestinians and has abducted around 40% of their entire population. And they take them to military courts that have a 99% conviction rate. Despite all of that, they only ever call them prisoners. Not over here, matey. They're hostages over here, all right? So he begged the world to stop them from destroying his hospital. He begged. He made a video. He cried. He said, please, don't let them destroy. This is the last standing hospital. And they're surrounding us. They're starting to shoot at us. And guess what? The world did nothing. The world just watched day in and day out as they terrorized this hospital, as they mass murdered, as they did horrific things to people inside that hospital, until eventually he was forced to walk out and surrender himself to the most brutal, sadistic army in the world, where he's been tortured ever since. Okay, put this on the news.
Yeah, what a story.
But, he's just one. He's just one of thousands of Palestinians that have been abducted. But it doesn't suit their narrative that the only people that get taken by Israel are criminals, that are prisoners, that deserve to be taken. Like I said, one night, Stuff News, after they showed the 3 Israeli prisoners, they did do a little bit of a story about Palestinian hostages, and they said, Palestinians say they also get mistreated. This guy was released. He conducted a terror terror attack with Hamas a few years back. So the one example that they give you an example where they can say he conducted a terror attack. We don't know, of course, what happened with that and what he'd been through and what he was fighting against at the time. But regardless, the fact that they picked that individual out of everyone, they didn't pick a child, for example. They didn't pick this director of the hospital, for example. They didn't pick any of the women that were held for no reason. They didn't include the stories about people being raped in Israeli dungeons, or even, some of them raped to death. Like, the most horrific thing that I could physically imagine right now is that is happening in Israeli dungeons, and our media is talking about the 3 Israeli hostages.
Not only that, but I remember seeing these stories, and it'll be like a really long segment of IDF people being returned, and you get to meet their families.
Yes.
You see their families, kiss and hug them.
They're named.
Yeah, they personalize them. They personalize these people so that we can empathize with them, and you see the tears, and it's quite a beautiful thing. And then sometimes in that same segment, they will then also say, oh, and some Palestinians will return as well. The tiniest little part.
He's
just
not
kinda
even exaggerating.
Just thrown on at the end. And of course, those people don't get personalized. We don't see their families giving them the beautiful embraces and they're hearing from their families in terms of how relieved they are to finally have their loved ones return. It's just a tiny little thing that gets thrown on at the end. It's yeah, very sad. Very sad.
Kapai, I was going to talk a little bit about the West Bank, but I might leave that for another time. I was just going to talk about how the West Bank is currently facing a genocide themselves. They're facing ethnic cleansing. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been driven out of the West Bank, and there's very little on the news about them. You know, how can you say that Israel is upholding any kind of ceasefire when they're firing at people's faces every day, right? So, you know, these things are important to continue and keep in the public consciousness, because otherwise you have the beginnings of a genocide when you don't know the context and the history. Otherwise, anytime a Palestinian does anything, our media comes out and says, oh, they did this out of nowhere. They're savages. They deserve to be genocided, which is what happened after October 7th. But if our media kept people informed consistently, if they had kept people informed about what was happening in Palestine up until October 7th, people would have been able to place that event within the context of everything, and it wouldn't have just looked like these savage animals doing it for no reason. But that's all I wanted to say about Palestine for today. I did want to leave us with a positive story.
I feel like you need to do almost every second day Palestine updates for everyone. I mean, there's enough updates, and there's a lot going on. You know, people think that there is a ceasefire. You know, people think that everything's okay. And like you say, people are forgetting as well what's happening in the West Bank. It's hard for everyone to stay engaged. Like, it's been such a tiring year for everyone keeping up with the genocide. It certainly exhausted me and has really like taken away a part of me, I would say. But it's yeah, we do have to fight through that exhaustion. And so I think, you know, we've gone for like 3 hours tonight, but I think something that we should probably do is shorter stories, doing deep dives specifically on what's going on in Palestine, because it's needed. It's needed. Everyone is just so exhausted in terms of the way that they receive their news about Palestine. So maybe that's something we can do.
Yeah, so shorter stories I think might be the way, because people aren't going to want to stay and hang out with us for 3 hours every week, probably.
Just the diehard fans. We love you guys. We love you.
Just the really awesome people. So last story, I did want to leave us on this positive note. And it's this wonderful protest that was done in Hamilton in response to, in Rotorua, in response to the horrific trolley operation that the government did. So the government decided, because they're sadistic, to go after homeless people with trolleys, where their trolley is basically their only form of security. That's where they keep their positions and they walk around with them. The government decided that they were going to go out and collect and take all of these trolleys off people, arrest people with trolleys, and just basically terrorize an already suffering community. But there are wonderful people in our community as well. Like KS Spark of FTP Eats, which is a vegan food truck in Rotorua. And they decided to do a protest, and the protest was just showing up in the park and just giving free food to the houseless people in the community as a show of love to counter the hate from the government. And I just think that's really beautiful. That's the kind of actions that I would like to see more in our community. It's responding to hate with love, and it's doing something practical and tangible, showing community support, which we're going to need to do a lot more of as the government pulls out our safety nets from underneath us. So kia ora to everyone at FTP Eats and everyone who supported this kaupapa. I think it's beautiful.
That's a good idea, ending on a positive note. I feel like that's not something we've really considered much, but that is a good idea. We should try and weave in more positive stories into this.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's us for the night. E hoa ma. just a big thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And please do send in your feedback. We love getting feedback. For people who have sent in messages of support, some really detailed messages that some people have sent us, and some people who have put their names forward to volunteer. We don't actually have roles for people who are wanting to volunteer yet, but
just admins for comments.
Yeah, there is that. But, we would like to have more than that. We would like to have, discussion sessions where we can talk strategically about the kinds of things that we would like to report on. And we would like people to be involved somehow. We're not sure how yet, though, but if people are interested, feel free to message us and we can brainstorm some ideas in terms of how we can grow this into something. Who knows? We enjoy deep diving and doing research and portraying the news, but there's so many other things that we could turn this into. So just again, big thank you to people who are supporting us. If you want to financially support us, go to our Ko-fi, Aotearoa Liberation League. Through the description that we have on Ko-fi as well, you'll be able to find our bank account. As always, I like to say this, that we will always do this type of mahi for free. We believe that this is a space for us. We've found a space for us and we're committing to it. And so, apologies in terms of some of the little faux pas and whatnot that we make. We're still figuring. I lost my notes for a little while, which was funny, and almost completely freaked out. So we will get better at this. And yeah, just again, really appreciate everyone's kind words and support. We couldn't do it without you. And yeah, just thank you for making us feel appreciated.
Ka pai. Kia ora, everyone.
You do our sign off tonight, Samah.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And yeah, send us new stories that you want covered. Send us feedback. Send us hate. Send us love. Whatever you like. Either way, just keep on fighting and stay strong. Look after each other. And most of all, just spread the love.
Kia ora, kia ora. Pō Māori, everyone.
Pō Māori, everyone.
Have a good night.